Don told me about 10 minutes ago, would you officially introduce Stephen? So I said, thank you for the notice. But I'm delighted to introduce Stephen, indeed, and Dr. Stephen Farris. And Stephen has been on the west coast of our country for many years, and so I suspect not physically present at the Canadian Society of Presbyterian History for a while. But before I introduce him, I have to tell you a story about the CSPH. A couple of weeks ago, one of the big wigs at Winford Drive emailed me and said, we would like to buy 100 of your recently published little books on sex. Well, same-sex issues, just to clarify that. And so I said, wonderful, and when can you bring them in? And I said, well, I'm coming in on Saturday, September the 30th, the SPH, and I can bring them then. And so the bigwig, who will remain nameless, said, well, I'll come down to Knox College and pick them up. Then sent me another email saying, I didn't know what the CSPH was, so I Googled it. But he came up with a website to do with the Center for the Promotion of Sexual Health. And then proceeded to say, might it be good for the two CSPH societies to get together and solve some of our denomination's issues? Anyway, I had great fun about that. But back to Stephen. I first met Stephen when we were both studying theology at Cambridge, and that's many years ago now. And I recall very vividly that he and Patty invited me for dinner at their college, after which we attended a worship service at which the acclaimed and astounding preacher, of whom I'd never heard before, was none other than Leslie Newbigin. And I remember that decidedly. Since then, Stephen and I have crossed paths in multiple ways. One was his invitation to teach the Reformed worship course here at Knox in 1999 when he was on sabbatical. And guess what? I'm still teaching the Reformed worship course at Knox College. During the 90s, Stephen and Stan Walters and John Vissers and myself all happened to be living in Toronto during that sort of decade, and we decided to meet monthly, what my church secretary at the time called the Boys Club, and what John refers to as the Gang of Four. But in the presence of such theological greatness, of course, I immediately offered simply to take the notes of the stimulating conversation. Stephen has been a great gift to the Presbyterian Church here in Canada, a gifted preacher, a gifted teacher of preaching, and a compelling writer on preaching. And I know that because who knew, but just yesterday, on the train coming into Toronto for John's installation last night, I decided to pick up a book and bring it. It was a book about preaching, a collection of essays on preaching. And in the middle of that collection, I found an essay by Stephen Farris about preaching to churches in conflict, based on 1 Corinthians. And reading it on the train coming in, I just remember thinking, this is just so darn sensible. A great deal of, sorry, I shouldn't say this, but some theological writing isn't that sensible, but this was just sensible and useful. And so when Don asked me a few minutes ago, would you introduce Stephen? I thought, wonderful, I'll be glad to do that. Stephen, you're welcome. We look forward to your paper.
Now, I'm going to have to take just a minute to get ready, I'm afraid. I sliced the side of the end of my finger off on Wednesday, and among other things, that meant, well, it means I can't put things in my pocket very well with my left hand, but it also means I couldn't finish typing the paper. So it's half typed and half handwritten, and getting the bits in order is just going to take me a second more than I would like, particularly with only one effective hand. We'll trust I won't be too disordered mentally. I used to teach in this room, and I always began with prayer. And for our prayer today, I have chosen a prayer by John Calvin. It's entitled A Prayer Upon Beginning One's Work or Study in the Day. Let us pray. My good God, Father and Savior, grant me aid by your Holy Spirit to now work fruitfully in my vocation, which is from you, all in order to love you and the people around me, rather than for my own gain and glory. Give me wisdom, judgment, and prudence, and freedom from my besetting sins. Bring me under the rule of true humility. Let me accept with patience whatever amount of fruitfulness or difficulty in my work that you give me this day. And in all I do, help me to rest always in my Lord Jesus Christ, and in his grace alone for my salvation and life. Hear me, merciful Father, by our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. At some point, whether at the dinner table or when we were walking through Geneva when I was 10 or 11 years old, my father once said in my hearing that to know the theology and even more the piety of John Calvin, it is not enough to read the Institutes of the Christian Religion. You have to know his commentaries and his sermons, and I myself might add his prayers. For my father, the Reformed tradition was not a matter only of a system of concepts or propositions or ideas, which do indeed matter, and which he could describe both succinctly and vividly. It was and is fundamentally a spiritual orientation, a word which occurs in the church in different connotations these days, but is of first importance, I think. It was and is a spiritual orientation to the glory of God and to the grace of God made known in Jesus Christ by the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit. Now, if Dad knew that I would be called upon to deliver a paper about his life and work, he would be amused, and I suspect more than a little embarrassed. And I do not know if he would approve of what I will say to you this morning, but I know that he would certainly approve of beginning with a prayer by John Calvin. He could explain clearly and vividly every word and phrase of that prayer. And so can I, because of the example of my father. Now, this paper is largely shaped by the stories that my father told me, or at least told others in my hearing. It could as easily be entitled Stories from the Dinner Table, since my father and my ever-patient and resourceful mother constantly had guests at the table, and stories were always on the menu, even more frequently than my mother's spectacular pies. Dad would do things like say, "Oh, we're having Paul Ricoeur for dinner tonight. Can you provide a little extra food?" That, by the way, is a true story. That was the kind of thing that Dad would do, and Mom always came through. But some of the most memorable stories, and the ones that have shaped me to the greatest degree, were told to me while we walked together through the streets of Geneva when I was a boy. I had my 11th birthday in the city of Geneva. I had my first birthday in the city of Edinburgh. Edinburgh and Geneva when you're 1 and 10. How Presbyterian is that? But I remember Geneva and I don't remember Edinburgh. Now, Dad was one of those historians who have never forgotten that at the root of the word and the discipline history is that simple word, story. So listening to his tales was actually fun. being raised by a Presbyterian minister and by a professor of church history actually sounds grim, but it wasn't. Most of the time it was actually enjoyable. We had the usual father-son disputes in many different ways and tensions and in various ways, but the stories were almost always enjoyable. And in retrospect, what was happening with the stories, and this is one of those things I hope that you'll actually take home with you, the stories were traditioning me into the Reformed tradition. It wasn't a word that my father used. I'm not sure that it was in circulation before 1977 when he died, but that's what we would call it now. I was being traditioned by those stories that he told. The stories that are at home in all our Christian traditions are most important to tell. The stories of Scripture are absolutely vital to be told. And I was told those stories and provided with those stories. And not just by my father, but by my mother as well. Telling those stories is a greater task. But it is also important, I believe, to tell the stories of the Reformed tradition in such a way that 10-year-old or 11-year-old boys can actually enjoy them and be shaped by those stories. Here's a story that my father never knew. Ian Pitt Watson, the great Scottish preacher, was called to teach homiletics at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. And when he arrived in Pasadena, he was in enormous demand by Presbyterian churches all around Southern California. After all, he had a Scottish accent, for heaven's sakes. What more do you need to be a great preacher? Well, he refused. For about a year, apparently, he refused to go to any of the churches in Southern California because he didn't know them well enough. And he went from church to church and church and listened to the preaching that was taking place in many of those congregations. Not, I think, Bob Hollywood Church. I don't think that was necessarily one of them. It's a long drive from Pasadena to Hollywood, isn't it? Bob Paul was formerly on the ministerial staff there. But he announced after about a year that he was ready to start preaching because he understood the gospel as it was being preached in Presbyterian churches in Southern California. And here it is. It's nice to be nice, and it's good to be good. I am not sure that in many of our churches there is a more profound version of the Christian gospel. And the stories, I think, help shape people into a tradition which is ready to hear a more profound and more faithful version of the gospel. So it is a wonderful thing to hear a fund of stories from childhood forward. Our imaginations, as my colleague Richard Topping would tell you, are both awakened and shaped. Funded is the word that Richard uses by those stories. It is vital, I think, that in a Christian upbringing, the stories of our particular traditions be part of that storytelling. And so that is what I experienced and what I hope to do in a small way today with you. But let me do the appropriate historical thing by talking about family background first of Allan Farris and, of course, of myself. It is perhaps not an unusual story about older Presbyterian families. It begins with the birth of Janet Armstrong Farris, as she would come, in Dumfries in southwest Scotland in the year 1760. Those of you who are aficionados of Scottish poetry will recognize that that's 1 year after the birth of Dumfries' most famous resident, Robbie Burns. And in a town the size of Robbie Burns, Janet must surely at least known of Robbie Burns. I am relieved to be able to tell you, however, that she's not one of his 14 known inamorata. Perhaps that's the right term. I may mention, by the way, despite beginning with this Scottish background, that one of the things that marked my father was a near absence of Scotchianity, which was highly prevalent in the Presbyterian Church in Canada of his youth and indeed of my own youth. In those days, if you attended an ordination service, the odds were at least 50% that you'd get a line from beside the bonny briar bush. Speak a good word for Jesus Christ, laddie. How many of you at your ordinations had that story told to you? Scotchianity was not one of the afflictions of my late father, and he was, in fact, more interested in many ways in the Continental Reformation, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Sometime after the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, it may be 1824, according to some researches by my sister-in-law, perhaps in 1824, the then quite elderly Janet and her younger son, John Farris, together with friends or possibly relations, the Clanahans, the Dobies, and the Allans, traveled across the Atlantic and settled in Scotch Settlement, which is near Moncton, New Brunswick. However, they didn't stay there for very long. By 1830, they had decided to move west. They traveled by the then new Erie Canal. There is a letter that records that Janet, who must have been about 70 years of age at that point, slipped on a wet dock in Albany, New York, and injured herself quite severely. The letter says that they could not discover a fracture by thrusting. Can you imagine that? And of course, the absence of x-rays, that's the best anybody could do. But they could not discover a fraction by thrusting, but they carried her the rest of the way to the wilderness of Upper Canada, to the region of Glencoe, southwest of London. Tough people, those ancestors, tough people indeed. And she died about 7 months later. In the meantime, in New Brunswick, John Farris, her son, had married another Janet, Janet Murray. And one of the people accompanying the party from New Brunswick was Adam Murray. Adam Murray was Janet's brother. And he was the only one in the family, a very Presbyterian family, that was well educated. It was hoped that he would become a minister. We have a copy of a letter that he wrote back to his mother. And in that letter, he complains mildly that John Farris had not lent him $100 to buy a farm in Western Ontario on the Talbot lands. But he chiefly praises the land in Upper Canada for being incredibly fertile and rich compared to the land of New Brunswick, which is indeed true. It's wonderful farmland in Western Ontario. And then he says, but we have the chiefest blessing of all, the inestimable privilege of the preaching of the gospel twice every 5 months. Amidst the hardships of pioneer life for these Presbyterians in Western Ontario, Western Upper Canada, the chief consolation in life was the preaching of the gospel twice every 5 months. And he mentions in passing, by the way, that his mother would approve of the traveling preacher who delivered these sermons because he is a seceder like you. I think it must have been William Proudfoot, who indeed was an itinerant preacher west of London, Ontario. That must have been who it was. There are no particular records about the Farris family, which branch of Presbyterianism they belonged to, though I'm quite sure it was more of the Free Kirk tradition. But at least some members connected with the family were themselves seceders. Well, jumping forward several generations, this habit of moving and looking for better farmland, even late of life, recurred. John Dobie Farris married the girl from the farm across the lane, Mary Allan, hence the name Allan Farris. As young people, they moved west to Nebraska, urged to do so by one of the younger brothers, but for some reason that's not known, they didn't settle there long, just in fact long enough for their older son, Charles Allan Farris, Charlie Farris, to be born in the United States. But they did move back to Canada, and late in John Dee's life, with Charlie Farris, now a young adult, they moved to Saskatchewan and settled in what became known as the Palliser Triangle. They settled in what would become the village of Colville. Charlie Farris actually gave the land for the post office around which it grew, very near the Alberta line, southwest of Fort Battleford, about 70 miles distance. And the family story is that old John Dobie, who had spent his youth working in the heavy river bottom clay of the Thames Valley, said, "The lightest of this soil is heavy enough." And as the first European settler, he had his choice, and he picked the lightest soil that he could find, which was a very good choice at first. And those of you who know something about Saskatchewan history know what's coming. It was an excellent choice at first. And that's where they settled. Charlie had obviously maintained some Eastern Canadian connections, because he went back east and married a girl from near Petrolia, Ontario, from a very wealthy farm family near Petrolia, Edna Jean Johnson. And I can just picture in my mind traveling from an established farm in Upper Canada, Ontario as it was by that time, quite a substantial farmhouse, I've been in it, to a sod shack on the prairies of Western Canada. What a life. What a life. Edna Jean is the figure that I don't know much about, but is obviously of first importance. And the interesting characteristic of this is that Dad was talkative, sometimes to the point of being garrulous. But he didn't talk often about the things that were very near and dear to his heart. He told stories about other things. And when he told stories about those things that were near and dear to the heart, he linked them to the Reformed tradition. What do I know about my grandmother? Well, this is what I know. A number of times at those dinners, my dad would say, "For Mother's Day, you should preach on the church." And then he would quote John Calvin. "No man can have God as his father unless he have the church as his mother." And he would tell about going to the little church on the prairies of Western Canada and snuggling into her fur coat and being loved and fed mince. And for him, church was being very close to Edna Jean, to his mother. There is a story that Edna Jean was considered quite strange by the other farm women in the community. The story is that while she was an excellent cook and did what needed to be done, what she really liked to do was lay aside her work and read a good book. And the description of her is she was dreamy. Now, Charlie Farris was a big, strong, active farmer with a very loud voice. My mother, by the way, obviously preferred her mother-in-law to her father-in-law. But Edna Jean was gentle and dreamy. And I think that the love for ideas and the love for scholarship, I think that must have come from Edna Jean. The good voice, well, that came from Charlie. Charlie had the biggest voice in the neighborhood, and when he shouted at the horses in his own farmyard, the bull in the neighboring farmyard would rear in fright. And these are Saskatchewan distances between farms, mind you. Edna Jean and Charlie were born in 1915. By then, John D. had died. Charlie was the head of the family and the head of a very large farm, and as such was exempt from service in the First World War. Their first child, my Aunt Marion, Mrs. S.V.A. Gordon, for those of you who were active in the WMS, you may recognize that name. Was born in 1916. Elsie was born in 1918. She became a preacher during World War II, by the way, when they were so desperate for preachers that they actually allowed women to preach. And Elsie was a preacher, and my cousin Brian, her son, has a number of her sermons. Apparently she was the really good preacher in the family, was Elsie. And then their much-loved son, in 1920, the last of their three children, and that was Allan. And he was baptized into a local Union church. The church in their community was a local Union congregation. And I think that life must have verged on the idyllic, because the next farm over was Uncle Ross, Charlie's younger brother, and the farm beyond that was the farm of Laura and George Close, Laura being Aunt Laura, Charlie's younger sister. By the way, the great-granddaughter of Laura Farris Close is Laura Allery, for those of you who know her. And we have an old photo of the family, and my, oh my, there's actually a fairly strong family resemblance between Laura Allery, for those of you who know Laura, and then her great-grandmother, Laura Farris, for whom she is named. The closest family relative for my dad was his cousin Morris Close. When he went to school, Dad used to ride a pony into the school, and thus got his childhood nickname, which I heard people call him still when I was a boy, the childhood nickname of Yankee, for fairly obvious reasons. Yankee Doodle came to town riding on a pony. Well, that was Yankee Farris. And he was in an extended village. He was raised by a village. And I suppose the first trouble was 1925. Charlie Farris had voted yes to church union in the first two national votes. But he voted no in the final vote in 1925. Now, in the collection of essays, The Tide of Time, that were collected by John Moyer after my father's death, there's a foreword by Dad's closest friend, Charles Hay, about Dad, and he says that my grandparents were convinced Presbyterians. Well, you know, I think a best friend often knows things that a son doesn't about the people, but that's not exactly the way I heard it. The way I heard it was that my grandfather was ticked off about financial matters, that the Methodists, he complained, were fond of praying but not of paying. That doesn't sound like profound theological conviction to me. So in this small farming community, which in some ways was a big extended family, the church split in 1925. In many ways, church union in 1925 is, of course, also a church division. It's a complicated thing, and perhaps the best essay that my father ever wrote was called The Fathers of 1925, which tried to present a somewhat more nuanced view of the events around 1925 than had been prevalent in the heroes and villains accounts from either side that had prevailed until that point. It must have been difficult, however. Charlie became the clerk of session for the new the new Scott Memorial Presbyterian Church, and Ross became the equivalent for the United Church. Dad didn't talk much about it. He was probably too young to be aware of much of what was going on, but it's always interested me that he spoke a great deal more and more affectionately about his Aunt Laura than about his Uncle Ross. And I've always wondered whether that was a church division at the root of all that. So, 1925, first darkening on the landscape. But things were pretty good in the 1925 era. Charlie was doing very well on the farm, and Charles was fascinated by steam machinery, and he wanted the latest machinery, and he bought it. And he took a loan from one of the ancestor financial institutions of what is now TD Canada Trust. And he was doing quite well. He had his own crop to harvest, and he hired himself out to all the farmers around and doing extremely well. And you know what's coming. 1929, the market is destroyed, and at the same time, the Palliser Triangle, which had been unusually damp for the last 30 years, dried out to its more normal state, and that light soil blew away. And the family that was well off, comfortable, became dirt poor. That's the right way to describe it. My Uncle Van, in reflecting on the heart trouble that afflicted the entire family, wondered if it was because they didn't eat properly, didn't have enough food to eat. I know from my cousin Jim Farris, known to many of you, that relatives in Ontario had mercy on their kin. When I preach on Isaiah 58, do not shut yourself off from your kin, I think of those not very well off Ontario farmers sending food and clothing to their kin in Saskatchewan. Now, Charlie had been smart enough to put part of the land, either a quarter of the 640 acres that they'd homesteaded or a half, the stories vary, in the name of my grandmother. And so not all of it could be claimed by the Ancestor of Canada Trust, but they lost most of the farm, and they barely survived. Well, what kept them going? Well, there was a remarkable man in Scott Memorial Church, a catechist named John Brent, who was also the principal of the school. And John Brent loved two things. John Brent loved the Lord and baseball. Last night I wore an academic tie. If you see the tie I'm wearing today, it's a baseball tie. Because John Brent taught my dad to play baseball, and George Brent, his son, was the catcher, and Dad was the pitcher. And this is theologically important because the way that Dad got to university, well, it was twofold. The first was that my lovely Aunt Marion had become a nurse, and out of her pitifully small salary, she would send money to her much-loved younger brother because she was sure that he should be a minister. And from the age of 16, Dad pitched semi-pro baseball and got $1 or $1.25, which was a lot of money in the Depression, for pitching a baseball game. Oh, the other thing, by the way, that made life enjoyable was that on Saturday night, Charlie and young Allan would sit down in front of a crystal radio set and hear Foster Hewitt broadcasting to Canada, the United States, and hockey fans in Newfoundland from the gondola at Maple Leaf Gardens. And they enjoyed the antics of King Clancy and the power and grace of Charlie Conacher and all the stars of that era. And by the way, he used to tell stories about that. This says something about me. I was in my late teens before I realized he'd never actually seen any of the players he told the stories about. It was all from the vividness of Foster Hewitt on radio. So John Brent, the catechist, preaching on Sunday and teaching through the week. Baseball games, hockey on Sunday night or Saturday night in the winter. That's what kept things going. Dad was, in fact, the only young man from his neighborhood who even graduated high school, let alone got to university. There's a picture which, in a way, is very, very sad of the weekend that Dad went away to the University of Saskatchewan. And he's standing with his best friend, his cousin, Morris Close. And Dad is duded up in a blazer and striped tie and all the rest of it, all nicely dressed, ready to go off to university. And Morris is in his farm clothes. And Morris never had a chance. And so many young men, let alone young women of that era, never had a chance. Well, he did go off to Saskatchewan, and there another figure of first importance comes in. That's W.G. Brown, Moderator of the General Assembly. And one of the things that he taught Dad was political involvement as part of the Christian life, because W.G. Brown ran successfully as an independent for Parliament. And as minister of St. Andrews, Saskatoon, he had a huge influence on a group of theology students, including my father, W.G. Brown, one of the great figures of our church. And he's in the collection of essays that John was involved with about the 150th anniversary of Presbyterian College, Montreal. Some of you will have read that collection of essays. Dad studied and did well. In the little historical note, Charlie Hay says that Dad won the gold medal in philosophy at the University of Saskatchewan. I actually think that's a mistake. I think that Charlie got his wires crossed. James Farris was the gold medalist in philosophy at Western. I don't think Dad was. There is a note in a yearbook from the University of Saskatchewan that I've seen, written by his friend Bill McBride, also a Presbyterian minister. And Bill McBride said that Dad got the best marks for the least work of anybody that he knew. That was partly misleading, as a little bit of an aside. That was partly misleading. When I went off to college, Dad very solemnly told me that getting up for breakfast was very important, that breakfast was the most important meal of the day, and that I should get my good breakfast and get right to work and all that, which advice I ignored. And I actually got more or less the same reputation at Union Seminary as my dad had in Saskatchewan, because I would actually work in the middle of the night. And I didn't find out that Dad had done that until he went on a long drive to Richmond and back with Patty. Patty says that she could actually deliver this lecture, except she titled it "Drives with My Father-in-Law," when he would tell all kinds of stories that he would never tell me. And one of them was that, in fact, he never got up for breakfast, and he did most of his work in the middle of the night, and got this reputation for not working all that hard. But in fact, he did work very hard. And very late in my mother's life, she revealed something that my father was profoundly ashamed of and had never told anybody, and that is that he was such a country boy when he arrived at the University of Saskatchewan that they made him take remedial English, which humiliated him, because both his speaking and his writing was so rural and so countrified. Well, whoever, in fact, taught that course must have done a marvelous piece of work, because, in fact, Dad became a very good and able speaker and an extremely clear writer. Somebody in the faculty of the University of Saskatchewan really turned his life around. He then attended the University of Toronto. He was here at Knox College. He was the president of the Knox College Association and the center on the one hockey team in the history of Knox College, which won the University of Toronto championship. And he and his line mates were 1, 2, 3 in scoring. They had canceled intercollegiate hockey at that point, but they had a very active intramural league, and Knox College won the championship with Dad as the center. After his first year, they sent him to Rosetown, Saskatchewan, as they did with a number of the students in those days. Rosetown, Saskatchewan, to look after a small church because so many of the ministers had gone off to the military. And that was a formative experience for him. The church authorities offered these young men, as they all were at that point, the privilege of not finishing their degrees and continuing on in ministry. And he received advice from his much-loved professor, W.W. Bryden, that he should finish his degree because he had some academic potential ahead of him. And he graduated in the class of 1945, which was quite a notable class in Knox College history, and as the traveling scholar. And he went to Trail. Now, when I talk to older people about Dad, I hear three things. One was he wrote beautiful letters, and the second was he helped me through, and fill in the blank. And the third was, we loved it when we'd get him telling stories about Trail in class. And they would also say, we learned our practical theology from the stories that your father told us about Trail. But let me tell you, it was not an easy time. In 1945, he married my mother, Muriel. And they traveled off to Trail, and their first child was stillborn. And their second child, a little girl named Alana, was born with a hole in her heart. They could fix that now, but not in the 40s, not in Trail. And my mother said that she cried and she cried and she cried, and they couldn't do anything. And after 2 weeks, she died. But with the help of the local Anglican rector and with the support of the church, they made it through. Now, Dad told me a story from that era, late in his life, and there was no laughter in his voice when he told this story. He said, right at that time, when the baby was dying and my mother was very sick, he preached a sermon about Mary and Martha. And he let Martha have it right between the eyes with a homiletical 2x4. Why did she think that Jesus needed another casserole? Why didn't she have the sense that God gave geese to sit down and listen to Jesus? Didn't she realize that Jesus didn't need another casserole? Jesus needed somebody who would listen. And then he finished his sermon, took off his gown, and dragged himself off to the little apartment where the minister was staying. And at the door was a casserole, and on it a tag which said, "From Martha." And Dad said to me, whatever you do, don't bash Martha. So in 2004, the congregation in Trail, First Presbyterian Church, bought a new church building, one that the Roman Catholic Diocese didn't need anymore. It was a much better location, much better condition than the old Presbyterian church, which had never actually really recovered from being underwater in the Great Flood of 1948. And they invited me to preach at the occasion. And when I went there, I told the story, and afterwards, people buzzed up to me, the older people in the church, the ones who still were old enough to be young people in the church when my parents were there. And they said to me, did you ever hear the story about when your mother came back to church after the baby died? I said, no, I never heard that story. And they said, your mother had a beautiful singing voice, which I knew, and she was the soloist in the church choir, and as such, she sat directly behind the pulpit. And as the service began, your mother began to cry, very gently, but without cease. And your father reached behind himself and took her hand and preached the entire sermon, holding her hand. If you really want to know what my father was about, can you picture that? The young husband, the bereaved father, holding his wife's hand. That's who he really was. That's who he was. Well, after 1949, they moved to Bolton, Ontario, largely so that Dad could take a THM here in this new arrangement that became the TST. And he was the first THM to graduate from that system, which became the TST. And then in 1951, with his wife and his cousin Jim Farris and their new baby boy, who was astoundingly big and healthy, especially after losing 2 children. They could scarcely believe it. They went off to Edinburgh, Scotland. And in that time, his much-loved professor and then principal of Knox College, W.W. Bryden, had died. Bryden had a huge influence on my father and was, I think, pretty obviously one of his favorite students, since most of his books ended up in my father's library. And John Vissers may recall this when he was working on his book on W.W. Bryden. John came into the library, into the office, and we looked through to see what the markings were in these books from Bryden, and I think John found some real interest in that. And there was a letter from Bryden to my father, which included a line that I think Bryden used on a number of occasions, but I think of great importance to be remembered in our present situation in the church. Dad had written to congratulate Bryden on a vote in the old Toronto Presbytery, which had been a bit of a thorn in the flesh of Bryden's side, which turned out well for Bryden, and he congratulated him. And Bryden basically told my father not to congratulate him for that kind of victory, for he said, victory in the realms of politics are often defeats in the realm of the Spirit. I pass that on to you. Victories in the realm of politics are often defeats in the realm of the Spirit. Well, that was a huge influence on my father. They called the then 32-year-old, without a PhD, back to Toronto. Well, he, of course, he had been hoping to get his PhD, as Jim did, for example, in Edinburgh, and as Charlie Hay did also, but that was off. What was important in the 1950s was the study years at the University of Chicago under Yaroslav Pelikan. And though what I remember chiefly was getting Chicago White Sox pajamas, and a story about watching Ted Williams hit in batting practice and knock home run after home run. Baseball is just as important. You got that? It's well up there in the rate. And so he didn't do that. And in 1960, he did study. He got straight A's in all his stuff and never finished his PhD. Why not? Well, he'd rather preach. Late in his life, when he had heart trouble, the doctor told him he couldn't preach anymore, and he told the doctor, I'd rather die. I understand that. I do. I'd rather die. The other thing is he sat and listened to stories. He wasn't just a storyteller. He listened to the stories of the students. And the other thing, I think, was that he didn't really have the patience for the kind of PhD dissertation that is really detail-oriented. He used to tell a story about somebody who'd written a PhD on agriculture and the dairy industry in a certain county, and he covered the subject, and I quote, teat by teat. And he had no patience for that kind of story. And that's when we went for our walks through Geneva. He traveled to Geneva to study the work of Theodore Beza, which I don't think he was all that interested in the long run, and Theodore Beza. And he would take his young son, who was the best French speaker in the family by that point, very quickly. Dad had what you might call Diefenboulanger boulanger French. And he'd take him and walk him and take him. We discovered together the site where Servetus was burned. And he told me the story of Servetus and the expiatory monument, which is the only expiatory monument in all Europe, set up by the city fathers of Geneva. Or the Great Wall, the Reformation monument with the stories of Oliver Cromwell and John Knox, and William Farel, and of course Calvin himself. All these stories after stories after stories. Professional historian? Sure. But maybe a storyteller. Maybe that's more important. Here's just one that I remember most vividly. The Baker of Geneva listened to a sermon by John Calvin about giving God the glory. And the Baker of Geneva was so overwhelmed by this wonderful sermon that after the sermon he went up to Calvin and said, Maître Calvin, how may I give God glory? And expected religious answer, climb a mountain and pray on your knees or something like that. And Calvin looked at him and said, bake good bread. And that's the Reformed tradition. Now, I kept looking for that story in history books. I've never found it. I organized a Calvin at 500 conference in Vancouver. We got Bruce Gordon of Yale, who'd just written this masterful, he was a student here, by the way, a masterful biography of Calvin. I asked Bruce about it. He'd never heard the story. For this professor of church history, arguably, the story was more important than the technical history. I expect in his classes, I know in his classes because he had many, many graduate students, he taught technical church history. But what was close to his heart and what he told his son was the story. The last time I saw Dad, we had an argument. Dad was not in favor of this new idea, as it was in 1977, that children should be invited to the Lord's table. I was then, and still am to this very day, very strongly in favor. And we got into an argument, a heated argument. I think it's actually a good thing that a father and son can argue theology. But it was an argument, it really was. And I remember the last line was, Dad said, but what will it do to confirmation? Very uncharacteristic of Dad, by the way, to use the word confirmation rather than the more Presbyterian profession of faith. And I answered, and I put him down. I said, well, what does it do to baptism? He didn't say anything. Perhaps I needed the advice of W.W. Bryden. Victories in debate can be losses in the realm of the Spirit. But I'm not going to get sentimental about it because I was right. And I think in the long run, Dad would have said it. I won't get sentimental about it, but looking back, I wish the last encounter hadn't been an argument. A few days later, he went up to the cottage. And early in the morning of July 7, 1977, what the Toronto Star would call the luckiest day of the century, 7777. Numerology is a crock, isn't it? We got a phone call from Michael. He's had a heart attack. They've taken him to the hospital. And after much trouble, we all got together and started driving north up Highway 11 towards Muskoka. And we pulled over into a gas station with a payphone. Michael got out and he phoned the hospital. And I could tell by his face. He's gone. He's gone. And we cried. We waited. And as we prepared to drive on, the morning sun rose like a red rubber ball. And Psalm 30, verse 5 came to mind, because I'd been traditioned by my father and my mother. Weeping may tarry for an evening, but joy comes in the morning. So one last story. We were walking through the old cemetery of Geneva. And they were digging a ditch of some sort, lay a drain perhaps, and a human bone had been exposed, a femur, I think. 10-year-old boy. That wasn't the kind who's worried about a son seeing this evidence of mortality. Didn't hide it at all. But it made me ask a question which I didn't know the answer to. I said, Dad, where is Calvin buried? And Dad said, nobody knows. He left instructions that he be buried in an unmarked grave so that no one could worship at his tomb. We learn from the past. We give thanks for the past. But we do not worship at the tomb of the past. One other thing he showed me on the wall was the motto of the Geneva Reformation. Soli Deo Gloria. To God alone be the glory. Calvin's dead. So is my father. So in due time shall we all be. But this is what I have learned. The word of the Lord endures forever. To which my father would say, Amen.
Of course, that summer of 1977, all the time, contact immediately with coming through with Stanford Reid, fall at Knox College. It's my great pleasure today to honor a very significant person in the life of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and specifically in our own Canadian society, Presbyterian history. I've asked Peter Bush to linger on from Manitoba for a few hours and come and share with us some of his memories of the 25 years that he's been editor of Presbyterian. Very significant contribution that he's made throughout the last. Well, I married Peter and Debbie in 1989, and then of course he went on to Lisbon, and then he's gone on since First Mitchell, and now Peter has all come to discover is one of the rare breed of people, a Michigan. All know what Michigans are. Debbie's a Michigan, so he comes to that rich heritage. But today I'd like very much to honor Peter on behalf of the Canadian Society of Presbyterian History plaque. Giving gifts is kind of an interesting thing. I was asked back to preach in my old church for a month for the day, and I told the story about the watch, the watch presented to a pastor as he was leaving. He noticed inside there was nothing there, and so he asked what the point of it all was. And then he discovered a little note: if you ever come back, we'll give you the works. So Peter, we are asking you to come forward now and to receive this and to share about it. I want to read the inscription here. It's Canadian Society of Presbyterian History. Peter George Bush. I said, what's your middle name, Peter? I should have even needed to ask. His father, of course, is George Bush, the eminent missionary from Beirut. Peter George Bush, moderator of the 143rd General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, for his outstanding contribution to its historical consciousness and awareness. Reminds me of my father's word, as he was about to expire. He said, I prefer taffy when I'm alive to epitaphy when I'm dead. There you are. Editor of Presbyterian history for a quarter of a century. Organizer of the Summa conferences celebrating the Reformation, author, researcher, publicizer, inspirer, globalist, and most importantly, man of faith. Peter, we're very grateful to you. And I have a little verse here from 1 Thessalonians. The person who made this black had some difficulty with Thessalonians, but she finally got it right. Therefore, encourage one another and build up one another in your, just as you also are doing. I love you. Peter, I love you. We love you. I'm grateful to you. God bless you.
Thank you very much. This is too much. I am honored. I am touched. I'm actually not going to talk about Presbyterian history at all. I mean the publication. Autobiography is fraught with challenges. Among those challenges is that such writing often lacks depth of insight and becomes self-justification, while offering no new understanding of the actions of the narrator or the situations they are describing. I hope this exercise in autobiography moves beyond that to offer us today some new understandings of the last 25 years regarding the Presbyterian Church in Canada's relationship to its confession, re Indian residential schools. Because this is 25 years since it was first introduced. 1992 was the first attempt at a confession. And I was at that assembly. The paper focuses primarily on my writing about the history of the Presbyterian Church in Canada and the Indian residential schools, largely because that's how I've been engaged in the question. But before beginning, I wish to offer a theme to listen to as we go through. Living up to the words of the apology, or in the case of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, confession, is a long process. Agreeing to the words, presenting the words publicly, is about the start of the engagement with their meaning. For apology confession to become part of the DNA of an organization is a commitment to living into a new way of being. To put it in its simplest terms, there's a difference between saying, we are sorry, and being sorry. The former is much less costly than the latter. One piece of background is critically important. I clearly come from my own perspective and I'm highly biased. My son would call me opinionated. I think he's trying to be polite. Throughout 25 years, I've written largely written from outside of the decision-making processes at the national level around the confession, the steps towards healing and reconciliation. So that when I write about the national structures, I do so as one who's analyzing actions and impacts as an outsider. The story of my connection with the residential school starts in 1989. We just arrived in Flin Flon, Manitoba, and CBC ran the drama Where the Spirit Lives. Do any of you remember that? Yes? I tell people I remember that, and no one else does, so I'm glad someone does. Which tells the story of a residential school student who ran away from the abuses of the school they were in. In the fall of 1990, Phil Fontaine disclosed to a group of Indigenous high school students in Manitoba that he had been abused. He was very careful to say he had not been sexually abused, but abused at the school he attended. And this disclosure led rapidly to his famous interview on the Journal with Barbara Frum, which most people see as the moment that started the whole conversation on a more public level. This string of events raised my awareness of the fact of residential schools. In September of 1991, at the Presbyterian Brandon meeting over lunch, the Reverend Richard Sands started talking about his experiences of being asked by the Board of World Mission to arrange for some people from 50 Winford Drive, together with himself, to listen to stories of former students of the schools. And in March of 92, I was at the Board of World Mission meeting when the first draft of the confession was introduced by Richard. All of this, to use a politicized word, was consciousness raising for the now 30-year-old minister from Flin Flon, who was off that year to be a Commissioner at General Assembly for the first time. That Assembly 92 in Hamilton was an eye-opening experience on many levels. But for the purposes of this paper, I limit my comments to this. During the debate about the confession, it became abundantly clear that the majority of the commissioners did not know the Presbyterian Church in Canada had operated schools, knew little, if anything, about what had happened in the schools, and certainly couldn't have put the two post-1925 schools on a map, let alone the 9 pre-1925 schools. The denomination operated between between 1880s and 1970. The debate included arguments against the confession because it showed disrespect to mission staff, especially the WMS, who had worked so hard and so selflessly in the schools. As well as suggestion was made that if the school admitted our wrongdoing, we would get sued. But it was with the lack of knowledge that I was deeply struck. Not that the other two responses which, if I'd paid closer attention, would have warned me of the stormy waters ahead. I have always wanted to write academically. From grade 3 on, I've been fascinated with the idea of saying something, discovering something that no one else had said or discovered. Seriously, from the age of 10, I imagined writing a thesis that no one else would have thought about. Yes, I'm weird. Well, I'd just been handed a topic that no one was writing about, as far as I knew. That is one of the problems of being outside the academy. You have no idea what people inside the academy are writing about. But as far as I knew, no one was writing about this. So I submitted a proposal to do a paper at the May 1994 gathering at Learned's at the Canadian Society of Church History being held in Carleton. And my paper was to look at the two schools, Bertel and Cecilia Jeffrey, between 1925 and 1969-1970. The proposal was accepted, and I was thrilled. And even though I was in Flin Flon, that seemingly intellectual backwater, I was going to be able to present a paper at an academic conference. And in March of 94, I planned a research trip to the Presbyterian Church Archives to read through material. The trip coincided with my attending a meeting of a national committee I was on. My first day in the archives was fruitful and stimulating. I could see the paper taking shape before me. I arrived promptly as the archives opened the next day and was told I would not be allowed to see the material I had been looking at the day before. I was furious, devastated, and deeply hurt. I did not understand how it was possible that it was okay less than 24 hours earlier to look at something I was now no longer allowed to look at. And I had been locked out by the WMS. I felt the distrust was palpable. I was a minister of the church, being distrusted by the church I served. And my self-understanding, as I now would call as a pastor theologian, was now in danger because how was I going to write a paper for the learneds without being able to see any archival material? But I couldn't do anything, so I got on the got up to the GO station off on Yonge, and there was time between the GO bus arriving to get me out to the airport. And I called my wife, long distance, in tears. In tears. When I got home to Flin Flon, I wrote Tam Corbett, then the president of the WMS, a very, very angry letter. For it had been on her instructions that I'd been locked out. In the end, a compromise was reached. I didn't have time to travel back to Toronto to do another research trip. And so I put in $600, then WMS put in $600, and 12 boxes of archival material were microfilmed and shipped up to me in Flin Flon, and I went to the public library and read them, those 12 boxes on microfilm. And so I had a paper. That year, 1994, was the year the confession was adopted. I was not at that assembly. Jumping ahead a little bit. The Reverend Jim Marnock, former staff at Cecilia Jeffrey and longtime minister of Presbyterian congregations in the Winnipeg Presbytery, in 1995 invited me to take up his project on writing the history of the Synod of Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario. A project I agreed to on a couple of conditions, which basically gave me the freedom to write the book in a thematic way rather than purely chronological. Second, to make sure that Marnock had read the stuff I'd written about residential schools so that he would not be surprised by what he might read. And third, that I conceived the book as going from 1885 to 1925 because I wasn't really interested post-25. He was comfortable with all those conditions, so I was off to another writing project, the biggest by far that I ever done, so at that point. In 96, we moved to Mitchell, Ontario, meaning that the archives are now only 2.5 hours away as opposed to a 3-day drive away. Now you need to know that this is 1996, made the move. 1998 is when summer of 1998 is when the first lawsuit arrives on Stephen Kendall's desk, the summer of 98. So I had a plan around how I was going to do the work for the book and stay in Mitchell full time, which included making a major effort in the summer of 2000 to get the book done, which meant going to the archives in 2000. It so happened that I was allowed into the archives, that was fine, but the chief archivist had been to the public archives in Ottawa and had photocopied everything that had the word Presbyterian in it from RG10. RG10 is the bulk of the material of the federal government stuff on residential schools. So every document that had the word Presbyterian in it was photocopied and was in a banker's box in the archives. Well, that was a treasure trove, right? Didn't have to go to Ottawa. It was only 2.5 hours away. It was wonderful. I had a wonderful half day in the box. And history repeated itself. The next morning I came in and I was told no. I could not look at the box I had been looking at the previous day. I needed to go talk to the clerk. So I stormed, I used that word intentionally, I stormed upstairs to Stephen's office, explained my project, explained I was not seeking to damage the church, and finally I could in fact drive to Ottawa and see all of this, which would be exactly the same stuff as was in the box downstairs. To which his response was, one more thing. I thought I was being brilliant when I claimed Scottish frugality on this one. He patiently listened, told me he would consult with the church's lawyers and get back to me. And he said he would do that day. So I left, and I paced the halls of 50 Winford Drive for probably an hour. and then checked back, and he told me no. The instruction from the lawyers was I could not see it because it was work product, and I could not see it. Further, he argued that if we let you access to the box of material, it would distort your research and leave you with a poorer book because there might be stuff you would have seen if you were looking at the material as a whole that you're only getting a sample of. To be honest, I had trouble remaining calm. Stephen probably would say I wasn't calm. So in the end, Western Challenge has almost nothing about RG10 in it. Jumping ahead one more. At the Assembly in June of 2000, Barry Mack introduced a motion that was passed, quote, Residential Schools Working Group in consultation with the Committee on History post a historical statement on Presbyterian involvement in native schools on the church website, and that such statement would include reports on the ongoing alternative dispute resolutions, reconciliation efforts, and projects funded by the Journey to Wholeness campaign. I was the newly minted convener of the committee, and I attended a meeting in the early fall of 2000 at which I agreed to write the historical statement of what had happened, and other parts about healing reconciliation be handled by other writers. So I checked out what the United Church in Canada had on its website and what the Anglicans had on their website, and was deeply impressed by what the Anglicans had. J.R. Miller had written a 7,000-word piece for them, and it's, to be honest, brilliant. It's a brilliant, brilliant piece of work. Now, I know I'm not Miller, but that was my model. That was my model. So in early 2001, I submitted my piece to be read by the appropriate working group. And Keith Knight, poor Keith Knight, had to tell me that my document had produced consternation because, quote, it admits to more than we are prepared to admit to. And quote, the piece demonstrates a great deal of research. It is a good academic piece, but not suitable for the website. And finally, we were hoping for a boring historical piece, like the names of schools and dates when they operated. When I told my father that last comment, he laughed and said, they asked you to write the paper. What did they expect they were getting? You couldn't write boring history if you tried. Now, he is my father. So it died. Was never posted. And a boring historical piece appeared with schools and dates. Clearly, the church was not ready in 2001 to own the truth of what had happened in the schools. The confession was only 7 years old and had not become part of the identity of the school, of the institution. Even though the PCC had confessed its sin, re-residential schools, in 2000, some 6 years after the confession having been adopted, the church was still terrified of being sued, was afraid of anything being published that might put it at fiduciary risk, even though it meant not letting the story be told as completely as possible. I have, for my 25 years, I think, argued consistently that the denomination, having issued an apology in which it outlined the wrong that it had done, should be open and transparent in its dealing with former students who might have sued the school. I understand the naivete of the position, but it's a position I believe is biblical and in line with the confession of 94. So I realized how alone I was when I introduced an additional motion at the 2003 General Assembly in Guelph, asking for a reaffirmation of the apology in time for the 2004 Assembly, which would have been the 10-year anniversary. And the additional motion was rejected. Jumping ahead, and I'll move much faster. I'd been away from Manitoba for 8 years in 2004, and my research interests had moved away from the West and Indian residential schools onto other things. And then, not through our planning, but through the call of God, we ended up back in Manitoba in 2007. And I was again called in, drawn into the Indian Residential School conversation, primarily through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And here the story becomes more muddied, because up until then, my involvement was purely as researcher. Now I actually was playing a role in healing and reconciliation work. In the lead up to the first attempt to name the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the 4 historic churches had a cross-Canada tour called Remembering the Children, with stops in various cities. And the Presbyterians were tagged for planning the Winnipeg event. And since I was the one who'd been writing about this stuff, the National Church tagged me as the local point person for the project. The event was held in March of 2008 at the Forks in Winnipeg, and Elijah Harper was the keynote speaker to a packed house. Sorry, I'm off on a tangent. Harper was an extraordinary character, absolutely. His brother, who also was a survivor of the schools, had died 8 hours before he stepped on the stage to speak. And Harper basically held his grandson, who was probably 8 months old at the time, and wept for 10 minutes. That was his speech. It was a deeply, deeply moving moment. Profound. That work then led into the sprint in the early 2010 that was a preparation for the first national event of the TRC held in Winnipeg in May. The church tent was, again, a locally driven project, and I was invited to be at a table during that planning and was humbled to be part of a panel conversation on one of the days. The new openness of the church to talk about what was now happening in the schools, now the settlement agreement had been reached, led me to rethink my writing academically about the schools. Until 2010, I'd been writing with 2 purposes. First, to tell the church about the where and the what of the schools, and second, to be clear that bad things had happened in Presbyterian-operated schools. Now I've thought a new piece needed to be added. As the pendulum of public opinion moved both inside and outside the church to say the schools were all bad, I started to seek out stories of people and moments where the church had acted for reconciliation and walking together. People who could be held up as models in the present to reflect how to live healing and reconciliation as they had tried to in the context of the past. The first of those pieces was a piece I did in the academic conference that accompanied the TRC event in Winnipeg, focusing on Kate Gillespie and her sister Janet, who served the File Hills Residential School in Saskatchewan. I had visited the Motherwell homestead in Saskatchewan, which is where Kate Gillespie moved to when she married and became Kate Motherwell. It was a risky piece to present at a TRC event to try to tell a positive story. And so I was very afraid of what was going to happen. But the room, to an overflowing crowd, was positive, and to my great joy, a survivor of the school spoke in glowing terms about Gillespie, and so supported the kind of work I was thinking about. It so happened that at that conference, John Malloy, who was the TRC's first research director, was sitting in the audience. He came up to me afterwards and said I should submit a response to the TRC's call for proposals and research work. And to make a long story short, I got the contract to do research on how the churches got to sorry, the TRC's words. A project that took up most of my free time in 2010. That expanded to a project with the TRC when they wanted a limited analysis of the project the churches had funded as part of their apology. Ironically, almost nothing of the first part of the project appears in the TRC's report, while the conclusions of the second part do appear in the report. Again, that felt like a good place to close. I felt I was almost done. my work with the residential schools. But in August of 2014, I was invited to speak words of apology and confession at a gathering at the Round Lake sites for the Cecilia Jeffrey School. So Cecilia Jeffrey moved in 1929 from Shoal Lake to just outside of Kenora at Round Lake. And I had the opportunity to speak apology and confession. It was a profoundly moving moment. The details are beyond the scope of the paper, but it drew me into new lines of thought about residential schools. I became interested in how confession apology is spoken, and particularly interested in how the repetition of the apologies is critical. That is, that speaking the apology in a new time and context gives apology new life and causes a kind of walking together as a part of this reconciliation. So playing with those ideas, I presented papers in the last 2 years. But then earlier this year, I returned to the question of models from the past who might help us think in the future when I told the story of W.W. McLaren and Suzette Blackbird as a dramatic monologue at an academic conference in Ottawa. I wasn't quite sure how that was going to go down, and people were very positive. So, in my life, the topic of the schools keeps coming back and back and back 25 years later. I recognize in writing this piece that I can see the work of the first 12, 15 years of my writing with great clarity. I'm not so sure the more recent stuff I can think about in a highly structured way. But let me conclude with this. That saying for the period from 1992 to 2004 has been a very different world than 2008 to now. In part because the pendulum has shifted from the schools either complete unknowing of the schools or that the schools are basically good to a time now where the schools are completely bad. And I'm not sure the general public has any more nuanced understanding now than they did before. I think they know where they are. I think they know they existed. That's progress. But I'm not sure we have any better, true, nuanced understanding of the schools. So, thank you for the honor. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for letting me get it off my chest.
After a very stimulating morning, we've had a lot of interesting challenges and some controversies, so perhaps I can say something controversial as well. Before I begin, this is a bit of a segue from our previous speaker because, as you heard, Peter's wife is a Mish kid, like me, a China Mish kid. And if you know anybody who speaks Chinese, or reads Chinese, more importantly, I did bring some commentaries here from the history of my father's seminary in China. This is a third edition. The Chinese are ravenously hungry for church history. Chinese Christians are fascinated by their roots. And this actually has a picture of the founder of my father's seminary, and the characters are Huabei Shunshui Yuan, the North China Theological Seminary, which was the largest seminary in China between the First and Second World Wars. And so if anybody has anybody that knows that, there are lots of pictures here, including one of me as a 10-year-old. And you're welcome to take them, because I keep getting these boxes of commentary, not commentary, why do I keep calling them commentary? Boxes of these histories. I had the first edition, I never got rid of that. I think they sent me 50 or 60 copies of the second edition, and now I have 40 sitting in my garage of the third edition. So, as we say in Chinese, Zouan, please, enough is enough. But I can't seem to tell my generous Chinese friends that that's... Next year, I hope my book will be coming out, which is titled China Mish Kid. Well, I'm talking about Stanford Reid, and it seemed like a very good bridge from what Allan has told us, a fascinating story that Allan, listen to me, it's the problem. At my age, you start losing the generations, that Stephen was telling us about, because I think this is a good bridge. As I said, Stanford Reid was asked to teach suddenly in 1977 after Allan died, and he taught here at Knox College for several years. In fact, he was up for being church history professor, but of course at that time I think he was in his late 50s, wasn't he? So it wasn't possible. I begin, if anybody wants a paper copy, if it would help you to follow or do anything, there are a few here. I printed some out. But there we are. In 1953, the film Martin Luther was released. In many ways, it was a pathfinder, filmed 7 years after the war in Wiesbaden, Germany. It was an attempt to portray the life of the reformer in a factual way. Has anybody seen the PBS Martin Luther? Have you seen, do people watch PBS? I don't know. I watch PBS. It's about the only channel I watch, but they did a wonderful Martin Luther recently in commemoration of the Reformation. A portrait of the life of the reformer in a factual way that nonetheless was popular and proved in a different social environment than today. A box office hit. How many people would go in to see Martin Luther today? In every place that could be shown, except in the province of Quebec. There, the provincial board of censors, all francophones and Roman Catholic, banned it being shown in all but the basements of Protestant churches. The film producers anticipated that there would be opposition, and they were prepared. One of the scripts writers was arguably the preeminent church historian that we've just heard about, 20th century, Yaroslav Pelikan. And in the script you have, as the film begins, this is a dramatization of a decisive moment in human history. And it's the result of careful research of facts and conditions in the 16th century as reported by historians of many faiths. One of the two scriptwriters was arguably the preeminent church historian of the 20th century, Yaroslav Pelikan. A preacher's kid from Ohio, whose father was a Slovak Lutheran pastor, and who himself eventually converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. Kind of ironic. Ironically, the role of Martin Luther, I find this fascinating, was played brilliantly by a Roman Catholic Dubliner, Neil McGuinness, Dublin family, a prominent Dublin family, went to an exclusive Catholic boarding school in Lancashire, and who served in the Royal Navy during the war as a doctor, as a house doctor. So this is Martin Luther that you see on the screen. Have anybody seen this earlier film, Martin Luther? Some of you remember it? He did a magnificent job. In Montreal, Protestant churches took advantage of the opportunities the censor provided them and turned their halls into crowded viewing places for an X-rated film. Crowded out, only language protected the innocent Francophone Roman Catholics from being subject to such incendiary material. It was both tragic and humorous. One person who did not laugh was a Presbyterian minister who had 2 years earlier left the congregation he planted in suburban town of Montreal, a leafy suburb, if there ever was one at that time. The leafy suburb of TMR, as we call it. Montrealers will be familiar with that. He left that position to be an associate professor of history and warden of university residences at McGill. As convener of the Social Action Committee of the Presbyterian Church in Canada's Presbyterian of Montreal, Stanford Reid fulminated There's no other word for it. Such a ban is very clearly and definitely a curtailment of the freedom of the people of this province to see this great historical and religious production. If this totalitarian philosophy is accepted, any other board could, in principle, censor books, newspapers, or even sermons. The mind boggles. The thought is incredible. The hyperbole was vintage Stanford Reid. Indeed, a film on Martin Luther, particularly one of such historical and artistic excellence, resonated with him. He had spent his whole adult life studying the Reformation, studying the being an interpreter of the Reformation. Growing up in the province of Quebec with its ultramontane Catholicism, at that time the Protestant Anglophone community was almost defined by its position as a minority Christian alternative in Quebec. Stanford Reid grew up under the shadow of a pervasive and powerful Roman Catholicism whose reach seemed unlimited. Indeed, to an extent unimaginable today, the whole religious culture and social life of the province was dominated by the Église and the curé. The Protestant Anglophone minority was deeply impacted. There was a loyalty to the religious establishment which made Protestants in Quebec find their alternative identity in their local parish or congregation, defined by who their minister was. When I went around the cottages in the Laurentians, when I was student pastor in McGill and outside Saint-Jérôme, I was fascinated by the fact that people didn't say, I go to such and such a church, I go to Jack McBride's church, or I go to Richie Bell's church. This kind of identity was very personal and very direct. And of course, the French Francophone people going to church, the opposite response by the Anglophones. The loyalties were very deep and very committed. And I think really, historically, it could be proved that people in the Anglophone minority in Quebec was far more church attending and church committed than anywhere else in the country, for that matter. It's a very interesting study, and I find it fascinating to look at the Protestant minority in Quebec. There was an inbred suspicion among Quebec Protestants of ecclesiastical power and authority, and Stanford Reid was a true Anglophone Quebecer. I don't think you can call him a Quebecois, but what is the Anglophone equivalent there? Reid's published 1935 McGill master's thesis titled The Church of Scotland and Lower Canada was also a tract against religious repression, albeit of a Protestant variety. Scots insisted on the rights in British North America as well as the English for the Church of England. The Kirk started a movement which led to the downfall of all thought of an establishment in the Canadas, he wrote. The Scots in Canada would have their Reformation identity respected, where they had settled and insisted that there would be no repression of their faith in the interest of conformity. Theirs also was a Reformation heritage. After graduating in 1939 from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, Reid went on to complete doctoral studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And his area of research was the 15th century preparation for the Scottish Reformation. It answered the question why Scotland proved such fertile soil for the Reformation and welcomed the teaching of Wishart and Knox. And what can we learn from this today? All the time in self-imposed exile in the United States, a country that was not at the time at war, of course, Reid was applying the ecclesiology of Westminster's founder, J. Gresham Machen, to the Presbyterian Church in Canada and its theological diversity as it emerged from the church union struggle. Stanford Reid returned to Canada at war, took a church in Montreal and later set about to establish a new congregation, as I said, in the town of Montreal, which exemplified what he thought was the Reformation ideal. A theologically instructed laity with a knowledgeable and personal faith commitment, and also a committed membership, deeply committed membership. Stanford Reid's concern as he established the TMR was that each person could give a personal testimony of his personal faith in Christ. And as those of you who have been in Montreal know, that vision quickly changed after Reid left that congregation. But this was his ideal, and it was founded on what he thought was the strength of the Reformation Church. At the same time, he was a lecturer, and after 1948, an assistant professor in the history department at McGill University. In a bitter conflict during the 1951 General Assembly, he was finally turned down for an appointment as professor of church history at Presbyterian College, Montreal. His reputation as an outspoken contrarian seeking to call the Presbyterian Church in Canada back to its Reformation roots made him controversial, to say the least. The qualms of Robert Lennox, the principal of Presbyterian College, Montreal, an erstwhile friend and fellow InterVarsity Christian Fellowship chapter member, were simply too great. Lennox had grown up in Ottawa's Gospel Tabernacle, had gone on to Princeton Seminary, and you could say was a convinced anti-fundamentalist, as he would call it. So it came about that, deprived of an official platform for his concerns about the Presbyterian Church in Canada, in the autumn of 1951, Reid initiated a new magazine titled, predictably, Reformation Today. His opening salvo was a passionate cry. What the church needs today is first to return to those basic Reformation doctrines. Protestant Reformation always insisted that the church must keep close to the scriptures as the only true basis of Christian knowledge and feeling. It was as a result of these basic biblical studies that they were able to formulate fundamental Protestant doctrines such as the authority of the Bible, justification by faith, and salvation by grace. To Reid, the Reformation was not only a recovery of biblical truth, it was also a renewal of Christian experience. What is needed, he went on to say, is a revival of Protestant spiritual vigor. There is a new need for that enthusiasm, self-sacrifice, and aggressiveness, which characterized the 16th century Reformation. His advocacy of a return to the Reformation was also very practical and pastoral. Another article on the next page of that issue advocated the so-called, quote, family altar as the cornerstone of the Reformation. Before there can be any revival of or reformation of the church, we must rebuild the family's religious foundations. Like Luther, Reid thought, childless though he was, that there was a commitment in the Reformation experience to a Christian faith that was nurtured in the home. I quote again, what was Protestant Reformation? He asked in the next issue. Most people are very vague about the Reformation. Even those who consider themselves fairly knowledgeable think that it was led by two men, Luther and Calvin. And with the revival of the knowledge of justification by faith, he went on, religion had become much more personal. He frequently quoted Calvin's great prayer and motto, my heart, O Lord, I offer to you, promptly and sincerely. Coming out of the church union controversy, in which his father and Uncle Allan had played such a prominent role, one of Reid's main emphases in Reformation Today, the title of his magazine, was a defense of a confessional, identifiable denomination. He refused to apologize for the multiplicity of Protestant denominations as a tragic legacy of the Reformation. Rather, he said, truth at the expense of peace was his concern, and the ecumenical movement, of course, was one of his particular targets. It was a strong reaction against the ecumenical movement then at its height in North America. Reid saw that the whole 1950s impetus towards organic church union for Presbyterians was a denial of all that they stood for in 1925. But more seriously, also a denial of their Reformation heritage. Reformation today also puts the spotlight on controversies in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, otherwise censored for public debate. It was done in the name of the Reformation. Quotes the fact that some people have criticized Reformation Today, the magazine, because it has dealt and intends to deal with the controversial matters. The situation in British Guiana, he highlights one issue of the Board of Missions of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The British Guiana mission should not be raised. The resignation of the entire Presbyterian Church in Canada mission in the colony because of different views with Secretary W.A. Cameron over whether missionary work was evangelistic, setting out to convert people to Christianity, or merely educational, had shattered an uneasy peace in the denomination that had existed since church union. At that time, a quarter century earlier, a precarious peace, a moratorium on controversy had existed in a denomination struggling to get back on its feet after the losses of church union. Reformation Today reflected the personality of its editor, was outspoken in its mission to recover the Reformation truth in a denomination whose theological integrity it maintained had been compromised. Reformation Today had a short shelf life of only 4 years. Failing finances, we have some experience with that in journalism of the Presbyterian Church in Canada more recently. Failing finances, other pressing concerns for Reid as an academic administrator made its demise inevitable. Reid became deeply committed to the Presbyterian Church in Canada locally and nationally. Locally, he established, as chair of the Presbyterian Montreal's Church Extension Committee, 8 new congregations. Actually, there were 11 that he initiated at one point. 8 new congregations. Amazing. You think of the Montreal Presbytery now, and it is now 20% of what it was during Reid's time in the 50s. And all of those 8 churches have either closed or are in deep trouble. So there you are. This is his great work of working. He was no critic of the church that was sitting back. He was prepared to get involved and was prepared to, as we often heard in the 1950s in Montreal, reverse the ravages of church union by establishing the flag of the Nectom and Consummator crowd. It was quite fearful, some of the publicity that I was brought up with in my years as a student pastor in Montreal Presbytery. We were going to reverse 1925 by establishing all these congregations and bringing back all these United Church people into the Presbyterian fold. It was marvelous distortion of history. But there we were, and it was a cause, and Stanford Reid was right there with it. Nationally, he preserved the church's tottering finances. The situation in the late 1950s, of course, was very, very serious. And he preserved that by the establishment of an administrative council and the introduction of sound business procedures. In other words, Stanford, in his Reformation, felt that the ecclesiology that he espoused, the ecclesiology of the Reformation, meant a direct commitment to the institutional church and involvement with it. And I really, again, the Protestant work ethic, he worked tirelessly. He would travel back and forth on the train when they had overnight sleepers. He would go back and forth between the building over here, 63 St. George Street, and Montreal, and he would go back, and he would lecture actually the next morning. It was just incredible. The energy of the man was unbelievable there in the 50s, and his commitment to the church was extraordinary. His reputation extended beyond Canada through his writing, particularly in Christianity Today, where he was a regular contributor. The magazine, funded by tycoon J. Howard Pugh, made evangelicals from front and center, rather, in North America, with every clergy person receiving a free subscription. His first article in the magazine, he would write 29 in all in the next 2 decades, was featured prominently on the masthead. You can see it now, that very epical issue of Christianity Today. And the Reformation and the Common Man, W. Stanford Reid, featured John Calvin as, quotes, the most thorough and consistent thinker of the Reformation, and emphasized the egalitarian and democratic dimension of the Protestant Reformation and the distancing himself from the politics of J. Howard Pugh. J. Howard Pugh was a great admirer of John Calvin. He didn't know anything about him, but he thought he was great. And because he had lots and lots of money, of course, John Calvin sort of made his politics, Stanford's politics, a little acceptable when he did that. And a remarkable person. Reid provided an alternative voice for the right-wing hysteria then dominating American evangelical politics and their thinking. What's different today? The year 1960, the 400th anniversary of the Scottish Reformation, provided an opportunity for celebration and reflection on the present state of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Reid was invited to address both the Synod of Toronto and Kingston and the Synod of the Maritime Provinces. There were lectures, 3 in all: the Scottish Reformation, a National Revolution, John Knox and the Scottish Reformation, and the Scottish Reformation after 400 years. The final presentation for those who stayed, if they lasted, my experience with Synod is that people try to get out as early as they can, but the third lecture was fascinating because, again, it spelled out, so much of what he did spelled out the vision that he had and his application for today. He wrote that as a church, the Presbyterian Church in Canada must take into account the fact that the Scottish Reformation still controls and influences much of its life. On the other hand, not infrequently, when we most explicitly lay claim to follow the Reformation, we vary most widely from its basic spirit and outlook. Consequently, it seems that in attempting to evaluate the Reformation, and after 400 years, we must attempt to look at its nature and its character to see exactly how far we agree with and how far we have wandered away from the faith and action of our fathers. So his final word was a ringing challenge. We, in our day and age, with much greater means of communication, much greater readiness to perhaps hear the gospel, have many advantages not enjoyed by the reformers. Yet they, going forth in faith, receive God's blessing and accomplished much in an amazingly short time. If we would serve, faithful and obedient to his command, we shall see his blessings come up upon us. This perhaps is the most important aspect of the Scottish Reformation and their message to us today, the Scottish Reformers. The church must be the church, but it can fulfill its obligation and its responsibilities only as it holds forth Jesus Christ as the Savior and Lord to this day and generation. Reid was already doing research for what he always regarded as what would be his magnum opus, a biography of John Knox. As he said in his second lecture in that series in 1960, citing Knox's Scots Confession, Knox helped to bring in the Reformation and helped to make it a part of Scottish life. I liked the comment of Scottianity that Allan Farris had. This was, of course, in the 1960s, the heyday of the Scottish character of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, which proved to be pretty deadly, I might add. When he died, Knox, this is death, he concluded, Knox left a church strongly impregnated with his idea, the church which over the past 400 years has wielded a great influence throughout the English-speaking world. The death of John Knox in 1572 provided yet another milestone for Reid to commemorate. In 1965, he moved from McGill to set up the history department at the University of Guelph, turning it during his 14 years as head of the history department there, into a North American Center for Scottish Studies. Delayed by a colleague's incompetence, it's a very complicated story, but the man, I think, had mental issues. He happened to be a minister of the Presbyterian Church again, a member of the Presbytery of Waterloo, Wellington, who later went to my presbytery when I was in Boston. And he was touted. I knew the man's reputation, so I just sat in the back row and smiled. He had reading privileges in the Widener Library at Harvard, and it was announced to the presbytery that he was affiliated with Harvard University. I almost said something at the back row, knowing what he had done to Stanford's schedule of writing and research at Guelph, and how the whole thing had to be postponed. It's fascinating little introduction there. And his frustration really in not being able to get down to the actual date, which was very important. And he wanted to get the thing out in 1972, but he couldn't. He had to wait. And it came out finally in 1975. He cited the fundamental lesson of John Knox's in his final chapter, summarizing again this long-term impact of John Knox. He made as a Trumpeter of God, which was the title of his biography when it finally appeared, a leader in a time of social and political upheaval, and shortly before Knox's death, Theodore Beza, of course, whom we mentioned earlier, Calvin's successor in Geneva, had described him as the helmsman of the Reformation. And Reid, both in the title of the book, calling Knox the Trumpeter of God, and in his application of the lessons of Knox's life, stated that Knox had brought about, quotes, the restoration of the church, close quotes, something that he devoutly hoped and prayed would happen in Canada and in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Knox was the kind of leader the church needed today, he went on to say. Knox has done much to set the tone for Scotland and the Scots since the 16th century. Personally, he took great encouragement from the second Reformation, from the Scottish Reformation. The General Assembly of August 1560, the great division which made Scotland a reformed country, the General Assembly of August 1560 described as the turning point in the Scottish Reformation. Knox's constant blowing of the Master's trumpet had an effect in bringing into existence a reformed church despite aristocratic lukewarmness and opposition. The rest of his life would be devoted to maintaining, extending, and defending the work established. Like Knox, Reid had many critics. A young man, A.A. Murray, stormy petrel who had split a church in Cape Breton, the church on Brooklyn Street in Sydney, had very strong views, a separatist, wrote him a letter, which he kept to the end of his life. And that letter dated in 1948. He was fed up with Stanford Reid's lukewarmness as he saw it at the assembly. I had looked to you to stand like Luther and Calvin against every form of false teaching in our church, but I had been sadly disappointed. If you keep your mouth shut, and go along with the machination of the machines, you may get a big church and possibly a professorship. God have mercy. But if you come out boldly in the courts of the church, you will have to bear the reproach of Christ. There you are. Stanford took this letter to his grave. It was a very emotional letter for him. His words, the words of A. Murray, should be placed alongside that of Richie Bell, famous Richie Bell, who was between 1970 and 73 the acting principal of Knox Presbyterian College. And he spoke of the unbounded gratitude of the courts for your energetic and conscientious leadership. When things were at a low ebb within the presbytery, you fired the enthusiasm of the court to launch out and undertake new ventures. Towards the end of his active life, Stanford Reid engaged in one final defense of what he regarded as the Reformation's chief doctrine, defending the Reformation. The scene of this conflict was startling. It was none other than the Westminster Seminary in which he had been trained, and which, of course, was regarded by right-wing true Reform people as the guardian of the Reformation, the Reformed Orthodoxy. And there, Reid he graduated in 39. He'd come back, of course, as a minister of the Presbyterian Church. As a trustee in 1946, he'd served faithfully. He paid his own way down for board meetings twice a year, traveling from Montreal down to Philadelphia. He'd given his life for him. And then one day in 1977, on leave from the University of Guelph, doing research, lecturing at Westminster, he and Priscilla Reid, his wife, remarkable wife, were involved in student life at the seminary. And one day she heard, to her great consternation, the professor of systematic theology saying that baptism made a person a Christian. And it opened up this whole view of justification by faith. I have a chapter in my book about it. And some of the reviewers thought it was very boring, but it's actually been regarded as a bit of a, what shall I say, it's a sort of insight into some of the infighting. It got me a DD too, by whatever that was. But it's a fascinating description of the internecine fighting within the evangelical order. In an article about justification by faith in 1980, he quotes Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. God deigns to receive the sinner with his free goodness, but finds nothing worthy in the sinner. He therefore must find the reason for his move toward God, toward the sinner, God's move toward the sinner within himself. And so of his own goodness touches the sinner, who responds by despairing of his own righteousness and placing his dependence on the mercy of God. As Reid would write to the president of Westminster Seminary, Edmund Clowney, in 1980, I never heard about the doctrine of justification by faith alone until, out of curiosity, I went with my Bible class teacher to an open-air meeting in the East End of Montreal, and that doctrine of justification by faith was set for me clearly and unambiguously. He'd not heard it, he's emphasized, in the great sort of aura of Westmount, Stanley Church, the recreation of the Constantinian Church in Istanbul. None of that. His father's rhetoric, he particularly found his father's rhetoric, which was his father was a spellbinder. He said none of this came to him. And he basically said the sickness of the Presbyterian Church in Canada is the fact that it doesn't make this gospel clear. And so he writes to Ed Clowney years later and says that he heard the same thing from Norman Shepherd as he had from his father. A stilted, intellectualized, non-personal religious faith that was boring and unattractive and he asked that this kind of denial of the justification by faith would be stopped. And the battle of the trustees took an emotional turn as he was to defend the Reformation from its stodgy institutional detractors, and he was on a mission. It was a long and costly battle that wore Reid down, but he stood his ground, defending the Reformation as he saw it, and the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And after several years of back and forth, led by Reid, Shepherd was dismissed by the seminary, and the conflict took a heavy toll on Reid as he left the board of trustees. Only his teaching responsibilities in Melbourne, Australia, where he went after retirement from Guelph, where he came instructing seminary students for the first time in his teaching career. This is the only time that he really taught a seminary course, a postgraduate theological degree. He taught them, and he hoped that they would be able to, in that way, ensure a future ministry that would provide theological cohesion down under for the rigorously regrouped denomination. Buffeted by cancer and with the deteriorating mental health of his wife, he died at the end of 1966. His wife, blind and with Parkinson's and mentally clouded, followed him 6 months later. There's a little section in my book that says when Priscilla Reid was told that he died, she looked at Peter Darch, the minister at St. Andrew's, Guelph, and said, "I knew a man by that name once." It's really quite heartbreaking. 30 years before his death, in an article titled "The Power of the Reformation Today," Reid had thrown down the gauntlet of those whose faith had been shaped by the Reformation. Their calling, he affirmed, is to launch out from the Reformation's basic principles in obedience to the Spirit and under the guidance of the Scriptures, to make known the unsearchable riches of Christ, even in this atomic age. This does not mean that they should reject or even neglect the teaching of the Reformers, but taking their basic doctrines, they should apply them in a 20th century context. This is the work committed to their hands by the sovereign God. And at the same time, they must continue to realize all their talk, all their thinking, all their anxiety can accomplish little in and of itself, but only by the Spirit of God sovereignly employed. Their work and effort will achieve nothing, but by the grace of God, their work will be blessed. That is Stanford Reid. I should just conclude by saying that it's very interesting that my 20 decades ago at my stage of life, what year was it? I wrote that biography of Stanford Reid, 2004, and he got various prestigious awards, and actually was the only thing that I've made any money on of all the books I published. It's the only one. McGill Queen's University Press pays me a pretty handsome amount every year, and my accountant loves it. But because all my other books are proving to be not quite so lucrative. But it's fascinating. I go to Chicago in 3 weeks' time, and the biography is actually being the subject of a bunch of academic colleagues around the room looking at it and examining what the book has to say. But it's a story really that I think needs to be told, and Stanford Reid's remarkable life, of course, is perpetrated now by the Reid Trust, which he set up, and which has been a godsend for many people doing academic work. That's my conclusion. Thank you.
My wife tells me that this is the kind of time of day when we might need to have something to keep us awake. And so we're going to have some pictures today. And partly because I couldn't resist. I just found these wonderful, to me, wonderful pictures online. And we will hope that they fit in nicely with the talk. And I want to thank Terry Sprack for his tech support, because I'm certainly not a techie, and he has set this all up very nicely for us. Well, I have to start off by telling you a little story, and that is that back in 1976, my brother, Richard, and I, Richard teaches history out in Edmonton at the King's College, or University College now. We were just young guys in our early 20s. And the CSPH, I mean this one, Canadian Society for Presbyterian History, had just been around for about a year. And so we wrote a letter to John Moyer and expressed interest, and we were enlisting in the society. Well, in due time, we showed up at the meeting for 1976, which was held at Presbyterian College. And when we met Dr. Moyer, he was a little bit taken aback, and he looked at us and said, "I really thought from your letter that you were two elderly retired gentlemen." Well, I hope I'm a gentleman. I'm certainly elderly and almost retired. So here I am to speak to you on this topic. Right Reverend Bishop Cridge and Presbyterian College, Quebec Protestants versus Catholicism. My family comes from somewhat of that same area that Stanford Reid came from. We're from the same basic stables in a lot of ways. But my family in the eastern townships of Quebec were Millerites. And if you don't know what they are, that would be First-day Adventists, or followers of William Miller, who believed the world was going to come to an end in 1843 or 4. And he wasn't a strong prophet. But he was very influential in upstate New York and in the eastern townships. And the Advent Christian Church, which I think still exists in New England, and maybe a few other places, very small, came out of that. So that's what we were. And we somehow found our way into the United Church of Canada. I'm sorry, Phyllis Earhart isn't here to hear this part. So it seemed odd that among the artifacts that we inherited in our family, buried away in a trunk in the attic somewhere, was a copy of the calendar of Presbyterian College for 1897-98. So this calendar was in the family. Now, why on earth was it? Because we weren't Presbyterians. Well, it belonged to my father's aunt, Mary Olive Vaudry, who was a school teacher and a school principal in the townships. And she had gone to McGill in the 1890s, and she knew many of the people at Presbyterian College at that time. It's interesting to go back and see, makes me think of what someone was saying about John Visser's looking through Bryden's books, and to see what's underlined or what's ticked. And she had ticks beside some of the names like George Pigeon and all the French-speaking people for sure. And so this calendar was in the family. And when I came upon it and began to look it over, I saw that inside, I don't know how well you can see this, in that list, about the fifth name down, is this very interesting name that aroused my curiosity and made me wonder, why is this person listed here? And I began to do some research, and the result is this paper today. The name is Right Reverend, this is how he's listed, Right Reverend Bishop Cridge, Victoria, BC. In 1895, the Presbyterian College, Montreal, conferred the degree of Doctor of Divinity, honoris causa, on the Right Reverend Bishop Cridge of Victoria, BC. His name stands out in that list of early recipients of the degree because very obviously, unlike the majority of DDs over the years, he was not a Presbyterian. He was in fact an Anglican. So why on earth was a bishop back in those days awarded an honorary degree by so non-prelatic an institution as Presbyterian College? To answer that question, we have to take a look at Cridge and his career. In his time, Bishop Cridge was a key player in Victoria and British Columbia. The province's landscape bears witness to his influence. Mount Cridge, Cridge Passage, Cridge Island, and Cridge Creek are all named after him. And he's considered one of the founding fathers of Victoria. The Cridge Centre for the Family, Western Canada's oldest registered non-profit society, continues the work that he and his wife began. It was a work for orphans, the Protestant Orphans Home. Today, the Cridge Institute for the Family, or Cridge Centre for the Family, continues. It serves food to the needy, aids single parents, and provides low-cost housing to something like 40 immigrant families. Edward Cridge was born on the 17th of December, 1817, so it is a 200th anniversary, at Bratton Fleming. And that shows you some of the countryside around Bratton Fleming, Devonshire, England. He was raised by his schoolmaster father after his mother died when he was only a child. He was educated at nearby grammar schools, and in 1837, at the age of 19, he was given a position as third master of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Undle Grammar School in Northampton. Sorry? That's the authentic word there. 6 years later, Cridge entered St. Peter's College, Cambridge, or Peterhouse, from which he graduated BA at the age of 31. While at Cambridge in the 1840s, the gifted Edward played the cello and helped to form the Cambridge University Musical Society. And a couple of people who were there with him at the time were, one was Lord Kelvin and also John Bacchus Dykes, who wrote many of our hymn tunes, like the tune for Holy, Holy, Holy. That organization still exists. After passing his theological examinations, Edward Cridge was ordained deacon in 1848 and presbyter in 1849. He served curacies in Norfolk and Essex and was the first vicar of Christchurch, Stratford March, West Ham, which is now a part of East London. He served 3 years there. However, the dedicated, hard-working Cridge found his health suffering. Feeling that a change might help, he applied for the vacant chaplaincy of the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Victoria and was accepted in September 1854. Some change going to Fort Victoria. Shortly before embarking for Canada on the Marquess of Bute, Cridge married Mary Win. Oh, there's the Cridge as a young minister. But then he married Mary Windmill, a devout evangelical who had been a member of his parish in West Ham. This was the beginning of a very lengthy and fruitful partnership. After a 6-month voyage, the Cridges arrived in Fort Victoria. I thought it was interesting that, of course, in those days you had to go around the Cape, South America. There was no Panama Canal. But they took a break. They stopped for about 3 weeks in what were then called the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii. So they had a little holiday in Hawaii before they continued on to primitive Fort Victoria. And they took up their work in rooms provided by James Douglas of the Hudson's Bay Company. A chapel was built in 1856 and given the name Christ Church. I also want to show you, when I said they are a fruitful partnership, they had many children. These are only 3 of the surviving children, 3 daughters, Maud, Rhoda, and Ellen. He became a prominent member of the community and gained the respect and affection of many associated with the Hudson's Bay Company. His simple Bible-based preaching touched a chord with many of the people, and his authentic Christian character was widely revered. Governor Douglas, there he is, appointed him Superintendent of Education, which was an unpaid position, which he held from 1856 to 65. For many years, Douglas and Cridge worked closely together. They shared many of the same values. For example, very open and gracious in their relations with various ethnic and racial groups, and including the Aboriginal people, and discouraged racial discrimination. I've forgotten the man's name, but he was an early, I think actually that man's from Vancouver, but one of the black residents in the early days. A lot of black people came up from the U.S. Douglas, in fact, came from a mixed race marriage, and his mother being Creole, and he in turn married an Aboriginal. A major challenge facing Cridge was the Fraser River gold rush, which by the late 1858 had brought tens of thousands of people to Victoria en route to seeking their fortune. Saloons sprung up, miners and gamblers poured in, I'm sure there were prostitutes as well, and needs multiplied. And this simply shows someone caring for a person who is, I think, has scarlet fever. It was too much for one man to care for the poor and the downtrodden. There's a picture of the orphanage. And so he appealed to the Colonial Church and School Society in London to send out 2 or 3 more priests to help him. The Reverend W.B. Crickmer arrived to share the work. The needs of British Columbia also came to the attention of Angela Burdett Coutts, a wealthy philanthropist who decided to donate £25,000 to support a bishop and 2 archdeacons. And she was, in 1860, George Hills was a moderate high churchman whose successful ministry in Portsmouth had impressed Miss Coutts, was sent out as bishop of the Columbia district. Hills, the son of a naval officer, some sources say an admiral, some say a captain, don't know which, tended to be rather aloof and stiff in manner, and he didn't mix very well with the people of the colony, whom he viewed as social inferiors. He saw his mission as one of civilizing the West Coast and making it another England. At first, the 2 clergymen got on well, with Bishop Hills appointing Cridge Dean of Christchurch in 1860. During this period, Hills wrote that he was, quote, very fortunate in Mr. Cridge, the original clergyman here. He is a truly good man, a sincere and devout Christian. He enters fully into all my plans and is a great support for me. And on the other side, Cridge was had a lot of affection for Hills, or they were friends. He asked Hills to be the godfather of one of his daughters, and she was christened Mary Hills Cridge. So there was a good relationship between these 2 men at the beginning. But the happy relationship deteriorated and came to an end in 1872 in what historian Frank Peake called the local expression of tensions which were being felt throughout the Anglican Communion. And he's referring here to the theological conflict arising from the Oxford movement, or Tractarianism, particularly the controversy over ritualism that came to the fore with what's often called the second generation of the Oxford movement, following Newman, John Henry Newman's conversion to Rome in 1845. The first generation, as represented by E.B. Pusey, for example, had little interest in liturgical change. Their interest was doctrinal. From the 1850s on, a shift took place that involved the adoption of Catholic liturgical practices, such as the use of Eucharistic vestments, the chasuble, alb, stole, and maniple, the use of bells at the elevation of the host, the use of incense, lights, that is, lighted candles on the communion table, or the altar, as they would say, 6 large candles usually on the high altar, the use of wafer bread, the eastward position, that is, the priest facing away from the congregation toward the altar, making the sign of the cross, and mixing sacramental wine with water. These practices were opposed by many in the Church of England, not just evangelicals. And there were even several famous cases of ritualists being prosecuted on account of these innovations in the late 19th century. At the opening of a new cathedral, the old had burned down, Archdeacon William Rees of Vancouver preached a sermon allegedly advocating a form of ritualism. Now, the problem here is we don't know what he said. I've read some accounts that seem to know what he said, but I haven't been able to come across that sermon. I've read another sermon by him, which he preached in England, and it is very Catholic. There is no question about it. But how far he went, I don't know in that sermon. It was described by the local newspaper, though, as both indiscreet and in bad taste. Most of the congregation were evangelicals, and as the same paper put it, listened with ill-concealed impatience. There's ritualism, I guess. That's a parish in London. in the present day, with the, you can see the red robe is a chasuble, I believe. And they're facing away and they're elevating the host and all of that kind of thing. And the people of Christchurch Cathedral, that was the cathedral. The present one is a stone building. They found after all these fires, maybe stone would be better. But that was the church that he was a minister of. Finally, just before the close of that service, where Archdeacon Rees had preached this sermon, Dean Cridge, feeling he could not remain silent while such teaching was expounded from his pulpit, rose, and much to the embarrassment of Bishop Hills and the visiting Bishop of Oregon, declared with a voice trembling with emotion, "My dearly beloved friends, it is with great shame and humility that as a matter of conscience, I feel it my duty to say a few words to you before we part. As your pastor, after what we have just heard, I feel it is my duty to raise my voice in protest against it. During the 17 years I have been officiated as your pastor in this spot, this is the first time ritualism has been preached here, and I pray Almighty God it may be the last. So far as I can prevent it, it shall be the last." Now, contemporary assessments of Cridge's action that day vary considerably, some believing them inexcusable, and others seeing them, as in the words of the Daily Colonist, the paper, a manly stand and a noble act of heroism. I should also say that, and then this is maybe a bit of background to what follows, that we might get the impression Cridge was a cantankerous kind of person, but I don't think he really was. Other accounts describe him as kind of a gentle person, a non-confrontational. Emily Carr, a famous artist and writer from the West Coast, had him as her minister when she was a child. And she has a lovely little bit about him in the Book of Small. And she talks about just how he was just this gracious, gentle presence in his flowing surplice and giving the benediction. It's a very touching account. So, I don't think he was a fighter necessarily. But what followed was a lengthy newspaper correspondence. The etiquette of the day was you didn't meet your opponent in person and have a debate. You socked it out in the newspaper, letter to the editor columns of the newspaper. And so there was a lengthy correspondence between someone called two stubborn men, Cridge and Hills. Bishop Hills felt constrained to censure Cridge for causing a public scandal attacking him in the house of God. Cridge refused to apologize and rejected the censure. Professor Peakes describes his attitude as inflexible obstinacy. After a year of debate, largely revolving around the bishop's desire to form a synod in which he would have a veto, Cridge continued to defy the bishop's authority by defending a polity that was virtually congregationalist. Cridge's idea was the local church with its minister is practically like a diocese. It's a complete church. Well, very different from the standard Church of England view. Cridge then took the step in the summer of 1874 of denying the bishop the right of visitation to the cathedral. As a result, Cridge was summoned to appear in ecclesiastical court to face charges of insubordination and contumacy. Dean Cridge admitted he had made some mistakes, but he also declared he felt the trial was illegal and irregular. After 4 days of listening to dry legal arguments, Cridge abruptly withdrew from the court, leaving those present stunned. He was found guilty of most of the charges, and his license as a minister of the Church of England was revoked by the bishop. Ian MacDonald and Betty O'Keefe comment he was stoic, but this schism in the church, to which he had devoted much of his life, was a major heartbreak. Dean Cridge continued to minister at Christchurch Cathedral almost as if nothing had happened. But the bishop applied for a legal injunction to have Cridge removed from the building. In a judgment of 7 pages of fine print, and I know what Peter was talking about, sitting in front of the microfiche, reading these pages and pages. 7 pages of fine print. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Sir Matthew Begbie, maintained that Cridge not only broke Canon 53 of the Church of England, which forbade a minister from criticizing another clergyman publicly, but also overstepped the bounds of, quote, social etiquette and propriety, as well as Christian charity. In the judge's opinion, Cridge ought to have issued an apology. He also felt that the bishop might have simply given a rebuke and let it go at that. However, Begbie ruled in favor of the bishop and forbade Cridge to enter the cathedral. And then this is the part that I really love. In spite of all this, the judge later wrote a check for $1,200 to cover Cridge's legal expenses. It was never cashed because public subscription had raised $1,500, which was more than enough to pay Cridge's expenses. It gives you an idea of how highly regarded Cridge was in the community. Ian MacDonald and Betty O'Keefe, in their sympathetic biography of Edward and Mary Cridge, Quiet Reformers, state that technically Bishop Hills had won, but his authority and prestige had suffered another very public and damaging setback from which he never fully recovered. I think we heard something like that this morning too. This unfortunate affair was part personality conflict, part power struggle, and part clash of ecclesiologies. The result was that Cridge seceded from the Church of England, and as often happens at such times, many of his parishioners went with him. Like the Presbyterians of the disruption of 1843, they walked away from their building to venture into the unknown. Of course, some, like High Churchman H.P. Wright, deplored Cridge's action. He said, quote, "Schism did its desolating work, and one who by his moral life and kind heart had long been universally respected and admired fell into its snare, so that he who began his career an honored clergyman of our primitive and apostolic branch of Christ Church is now cut off from her communion." One wonders what was going on in the minds of the parishioners of Christchurch Cathedral as they left virtually en masse with Cridge. It's quite likely that in Canada, as in Britain, Protestantism was viewed as a bulwark of English liberties, while Catholicism was identified with Spain, France, and Ireland, countries thought to be under the thumb of the papacy. Ritualism, high Anglo-Catholicism, was seen as a Romeward movement. Thus, deep-seated cultural prejudices may have been at work among the citizens of Victoria. Another factor that Alan Hayes has pointed out is the dispute between Cridge and Hills was also an argument between the Hudson's Bay chaplain in a company town and an outsider recently arrived from the mother country. Of course, the people's behavior may have in part been due, and maybe a large part, to the evangelical convictions that Cridge had instilled in them over almost 20 years as their minister, and they had a great respect and love for him. At first, the new congregation leased the Presbyterian Church on Pandora Street, but Sir James Douglas donated land for a new church on Humboldt Street. This is actually a picture of the funeral of Sir James Douglas. And on the hill, you can see Christchurch Cathedral, as it was then, and then just down the hill, and somebody made the joke, you've got the high church and the low church. Just down the hill, you had the Church of Our Lord. If you go to their website, it's COOL, Church of Our Lord. I'll let you think about that one. Now I've lost my place. At first, they leased this Presbyterian church, but then they built this church in the Carpenter Gothic style, someone called it, and it was known as the Church of Our Lord. It's now a National Historic Site. It was dedicated in January 1876. Bishop Hills confidently predicted that within 3 years, Cridge would be left without any followers. However, the congregation that's now affiliated with the Anglican Network in Canada, ANIC, is still going strong, so Hills wasn't much of a prophet either. Cridge lost little time affiliating with a body more in keeping with his theology and churchmanship, the Reformed Episcopal Church. Oh, there's a better shot of the Church of Our Lord in Victoria. The Reformed Episcopal Church had been founded in 1874 following the secession of George David Cummins from the Protestant Episcopal Church in the U.S. over the issue of ritualism. Cummins had been the assistant bishop of Kentucky, and now he became the presiding bishop of this new denomination. The Reformed Episcopal Church began in reaction to the Oxford movement in England that sought to revive Catholic doctrine and worship in the Church of England. Starting with John Keeble's famous Assize sermon on national apostasy, the movement, that is the Oxford movement, gained popularity in Britain and spread to North America. It appealed to the authority of the Church Fathers and tended to distance itself from the English reformers, such as Cranmer, Ridley, Latimer, and Jewell. Prominent among its tenets were apostolic succession, the belief that valid orders for ministers are derived only from bishops who stand in an unbroken line extending back to the apostles, the real presence, that is the doctrine that the body and blood of Christ are objectively present in the bread and wine of communion, and the Eucharistic sacrifice, the notion that the Lord's Supper is offered up to God as in some sense a repetition of Calvary. Some of the Tractarians, the best known being John Henry Newman, later Cardinal Newman, eventually joined the Roman Catholic communion. But many remained in the Anglican Church as Anglo-Catholics, with a few of them advocating an advanced ritualism barely distinguishable from the Roman Rite. And we might almost say that some of the ones who are around today are more Roman than the Romans are now. The Reformed Episcopal Church was very low Anglican. It adopted a revision of the Book of Common Prayer that expunged a few expressions they thought were not biblical, and opted for a simple form of worship. No crosses or candles on the communion table, no stoles, Eucharistic vestments, wafer bread, copes, mitres, processions, bowing to the table, or facing east at the creed. And the thing about the vestments is that, if I understand it correctly, I think it's a question of semiotics, that the priest standing there in his chasuble and all his vestments was a kind of signal that this is now high Anglican, Anglo-Catholic doctrine that we're doing here. We're not just doing Holy Communion, we're doing the Eucharistic sacrifice. We're offering Christ up again. And so the way the clergy dressed in those days, and for a long time, even into the 20th century, and maybe in some places still today, was very important. It was a signal of which branch you belong to and what you believed. In Canada, the Reformed Episcopal Church had a few parishes scattered from New Brunswick to Ontario, including one in Montreal and one in Ottawa. Now, with Cridge's break with the Church of England, there was also one lonely parish out on the West Coast. In 1875, Cridge was elected missionary bishop at the Reformed Episcopal General Council in Chicago, with jurisdiction from San Francisco to Alaska. He was consecrated bishop in Ottawa in Emmanuel Church in July of 1876. And he was asked to represent his church at a meeting of the Free Church of England, a sister denomination in England that same year. Although Victoria was at the time the 6th province of Canada, it was still a small community, relatively isolated from the rest of the country. Nevertheless, word of the Cridge Hills controversy reached other parts of the nation, and somehow came to the attention of the authorities at Presbyterian College, Montreal, a city where, as Don reminded us this morning, the Protestant minority often felt beleaguered in this sea of Roman Catholicism. And I should have showed you a picture of Bishop Cridge in his pulpit at the Church of Our Lord. And that is the Saint Jacques Cathedral, St. James Cathedral, now called Mary Queen of the World. And it's right in downtown Montreal. If you know Montreal, it's on what used to be called Dominion Square. It's now Place du Canada. It's right across from the Sun Life building. It's right across from St. George's Anglican Church, the Low Anglican Church. It's as though a statement is being made. We're here, right in your face, and we're big. It's a scale model of St. Peter's in Rome. So that's the atmosphere of Quebec society. The Presbyterian College was founded in 1865 to equip ministers, both French and English-speaking, to defend the teachings of the Reformation and evangelize the largely Francophone province. The faculty was committed to maintaining a Protestant witness in Quebec and extending the Christian cause through overseas missions. These were the days of the former priest, Charles Shinnicky. And you may know something about him. He was famous or infamous, depending on your viewpoint. And the college was part of a network that included the French Canadian Missionary Society, the Institute at Pointe-aux-Trembles at the east end of the island of Montreal, and a number of small French-speaking congregations, all aimed at the conversion of Roman Catholics in the province. I think my own family, if you go back many generations, I haven't been able to document this exactly, but it's family tradition lore that it was someone from the French Canadian Missionary Society who brought a Bible to the Vaudry home in Pointe-aux-Trembles, the east end of Montreal. They'd never seen this before, and the mother read it first. She was converted, and then the others followed, and then later they were persecuted, maybe is too strong a word, but they were pressured to leave the area and went to the eastern townships. At the college's helm was Principal Donald H. McVicker, a strong evangelical Calvinist, and there's a picture of him as a middle-aged man. One can easily believe that the Cridge affair would not have escaped the notice of a man like McVicker, whose sympathies would undoubtedly be on the side of Edward Cridge. Apart from a few points of ecclesiastical polity, the two men were kindred spirits in many ways. Apparently, when Cridge was in England, in East Ham, some of his parishioners thought his preaching was too Calvinistic. So I think these two men were on the same wavelength. Some 20 years after Cridge formed the Church of Our Lord, Presbyterian College decided to award him the degree of Doctor of Divinity honoris causa. The Victoria Daily Colonist called this a noteworthy event in Victoria church history. And I think it's remarkable that Presbyterian College chose to honor a man of a different denomination at that particular time, especially, who was considered the cause of what Peake terms a schism. Even if it took those cautious Scots in Montreal 20 years to make up their minds to actually give him this degree. One wonders whether there was any fear of offending the other Anglicans in Montreal by honoring someone who'd left their body. Although at that time, the leaders of Montreal Anglicanism, a number of them probably McVicker's friends, were evangelicals, including the primate of all Canada, William Bennett Bond. One suspects that the authorities at Christchurch Cathedral in Victoria, though, were not especially pleased that the Presbyterians had cooperated, the local Presbyterians had cooperated with the college in this matter. The reason for the granting of the DD was clear. Cridge had many achievements as a pastor, educator, and community leader. Yet this degree was given primarily to acknowledge Cridge's services in the cause of Protestantism. For both Cridge and McVicker, the Oxford movement, with its Romanizing beliefs and practices, was a menace, only slightly less dangerous than Rome itself. Its doctrines, symbolized by its liturgy, appeared to repudiate the Reformation and obscure the gospel of salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ that was precious to both leaders. Anglo-Catholicism was much too similar to Roman Catholicism in the opinion of Quebec Protestants to be seen as anything other than a threat. It seems that the college was honoring Cridge's reformed convictions and his willingness to take a costly stand for the sake of conscience. Now, you might ask, was the college also then declaring its approval of schism? Or was Cridge's separation from the Church of England even viewed as true schism? Was there not an implied judgment on the Anglican Church? Those are questions I don't have the answers to. Edward Cridge did not travel to Montreal to receive his degree. It was conferred on him at a special convocation held in St. Andrew's Church in Victoria on the 24th of April, 1895, replete with solos from Handel's Messiah and the presence of several local clergy. It was presented by the Reverend W. Leslie Clay, later a strong anti-unionist and the moderator of the 1927 General Assembly. He acted on behalf of the college. The letter from the Senate of the college inviting the bishop to receive the degree cited, quote, your scholarly attainments, eminent Christian character, and long and useful service in the Church of the Protestant Reformation. Cridge saw this honor as in some sense a stamp of approval from the Presbyterian Church. He stated on that occasion, no degree that I might have obtained in the usual perfunctory manner, I'm not quite sure what that means, could have been like this, emanating as it does from a body ever foremost, now and for ages past, in contending for the faith once delivered to the saints. Its approval means much. I accept it as recognizing also though not now for the first time, myself and the body which I represent as belonging to the great church of the Protestant Reformation. I shall take these insignia, by which he meant the red hood, and if you know PC's hood, it's a beautiful red hood, and I shall wear them and glory in them as most precious tokens of the honor which has befallen my gray hairs. Bishop Cridge also interpreted Presbyterian College's act as presaging greater manifestations of Christian unity. I think I see in this spontaneous merging of denominational distinctions in one grand conception of a common faith, a sign of the times. The church is flowing together and being enlarged. The desire of unity is universal. The way in which it may be brought about is the one engrossing question. Cridge took the opportunity to actually criticize a common Anglican approach to unity, the invitation to come together on the basis of the historic episcopate. This, he declared, was both ineffective in creating or maintaining unity and unscriptural. Citing the meaning of the Greek word episcope, he said of high church pretensions, a throne is an incongruous appendage to the office of overseer. He went on to give his view that the Evangelical Alliance was already an impressive model for the visible unity of the Reformed Church. The Anglicans, he said, should learn from other Protestants. Now, in today's ecumenical climate, the idea of a mainline denomination rewarding a minister of a breakaway evangelical group would be absolutely unthinkable. I cannot imagine Bishop Charlie Masters of the Anglican Network in Canada receiving an honorary DD from either Presbyterian College or this college. That's never going to happen. We're living in a different kind of time. And the issues, of course, that came up in this debate between Hills and Cridge would also just be unintelligible to most people today. Presbyterians have changed significantly since 1895, and our ecumenism moves in other directions. Today, it's difficult to imagine a time when Presbyterians engaged in polemics either against Roman Catholics or Anglo-Catholics. We share buildings, hold interchurch services, and cooperate in theological education, among other things. Roman bishops sometimes preach from Presbyterian pulpits. The ecclesiastical landscape now would be completely unrecognizable to someone like Donald McVicar. Ironically, the Reformed Episcopal Church has also changed from its early days. It is still conservative in theology, but Bishops Cummins and Cridge would be disconcerted, I'm sure, by much of what has happened to the church they founded. Like most Anglicans, many Reformed Episcopalians have leveled up, as the expression is, by adding the very vestments, stoles, croziers, and so on, that the founders scorned. The Presbyterians, too, have moved away from their strong Protestant convictions about evangelical doctrine and simplicity in worship. Today, the tragic division between Bishop George Hills and Edward Cridge is practically forgotten. But the legacy of Edward Cridge, DD, continues to be celebrated 200 years after his birth by evangelical Christians who admire his faith, courage, and compassion. Despite being a controversial figure at one period of his life, Bishop Cridge was a sturdy pioneer, one of the founders of Victoria, and a venerable leader in church and community. He died almost blind and suffering from asthma in 1913 at the age of 95. That's my picture about the Church Unity. Wrong one. There he is with his wife Mary. His last conscious words were, "I was determined as a young man to know nothing save Jesus Christ and Him crucified." Perhaps one of the local Presbyterian ministers present on the 24th of April, 1895 at St. Andrews, Victoria, was right. Presbyterian College, Montreal, one of the most reputable in the land, had honored itself by the accolades it bestowed on the Right Reverend Bishop Cridge.
Hello, John, from our part of the world to yours.
Yes.
And Amanda, your successor in the Kirk of St. James. Amanda, thank you very much for coming to our rescue and giving all kinds of help.
Not a problem.
Yeah, and John has given us this excellent paper on a place called Salt Springs. And I have quite a story about Salt Springs, if I can tell you. I drove up through the night to my first OM appointment, the ordained missionary appointment that the Board of Missions put you through in 1963. I think it was about May the 10th or May the 20th, 1963. And I was waiting for ordination, and I arrived about 2 o'clock in the morning in the home of one of the elders of the church that I was going to serve in East River, Pictou County, in Nova Scotia. And I arrived there, and the next morning, I think it was actually Sunday morning, I was preaching. I said to the couple, I said, "Oh, you're Presbyterians, are you?" And this lady said, "I am not a Presbyterian. I'm from Salt Springs, and I'm from the church that you stole from us." And, that was my first introduction to Pictou County Presbyterianism. And Christine was a remarkable person. But John will know all about that, won't you? And so Salt Springs has been a very important historical marker in our Presbyterian church. John, we have your paper. Mm-hmm. Everybody has a copy of it. And you can take us through it and say anything you want to say. And John, as I say, is a outstanding minister of our church. He's been moderator of the General Assembly back in the year 1991. It doesn't seem like that long ago. I remember John stopping off at my church in Boston on his way home. Do you remember that, John?
Yes,
and
I do.
He visited us, yeah. And that church, as it was then, is no more. So that's kind of sad. That's another story. But John, as I say, grew up in Pictou County, but he has served in the Kirk of St. James following the late THB summers. That must have been quite an august challenge when you first went there.
Well,
John has a very interesting memoir ministry.
Yeah.
How did you survive THB's shadow?
Well, I knew him a little bit before, but there was no trouble here. Malcolm Great was here in between us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Well, we welcome you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, and you can tell me when I can start.
You can begin now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the privilege of being with you this afternoon. To Donald McLeod for arranging it, and for our minister here, Reverend Amanda Henderson Bolton, for her part in arranging things at this end. I'm here at the church office now in the Kirk of St. James, which in past years was quite familiar to me. But I'm very pleased to be with you, and hope that you can bear with me in this paper. It's entitled Protocol and Property, Church Union in Salt Springs, Nova Scotia. This paper is an abbreviation of a chapter in my BD thesis on Church Union and Pictou Presbytery, a copy of which is on file at the Presbyterian College in Montreal. When Dr. James Farris, now living in Prince Edward Island, read my thesis, he reported that he had not known about the Salt Springs situation and thought that more people should know about it. Hence my letter to Dr. McLeod, and here we are. Unique things about the Salt Springs situation were at least threefold. Union of 1925 was not settled there until 1929. The key decisions were made not by church courts, but by civil courts. These courts were not only Canadian courts in Halifax or Ottawa, but also the Privy Council in London, England. The issue here involved not only the property, but whether or not the congregation would enter the United Church of Canada. First, a look at some historical information. In 1822, a congregation of the Church of Scotland was established. Within a few years, a church building was erected, and the name St. Luke's chosen. A larger building followed, only to be further enlarged in 1880. This is the building in dispute in Church Union and is still in use today. But 100 yards away stands St. Luke's United Church, erected in 1929. In 1845, some 20 families left St. Luke's for the Free Church movement. Being denied the use of St. Luke's building, they erected a building of their own and called it Ebenezer. In 1875, both St. Luke's and Ebenezer congregations stayed out of the newly formed Presbyterian Church in Canada. However, in 1908, these two congregations came together and entered the Presbyterian Church in Canada as one. St. Luke's building was used. Church union initially proceeded here much as elsewhere. In 1912, the vote showed a majority of 17 in favor of union. However, that changed in 1915 when there was a majority of 25 against union. And in 1924, the majority was 14 against union. However, another vote on July the 25th, 1925, was unanimously in support of union. Court action followed. The county court ruled in favor of the unionists. In 1927, this local court decision was reversed by the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia. In 1929, this provincial decision was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada and later by the Privy Council in London, England. These decisions determined whether or not St. Luke's congregation would become a part of the newly formed United Church of Canada or remain an integral part of the continuing Presbyterian Church in Canada. They also determined property matters. This prolonged period of conflict and uncertainty was the result of significant differences between the federal legislation regarding church union and that of the province of Nova Scotia. The vote of the congregation held on December 22, 1924, was conducted under the authority of the Federal Act of Parliament, which provided that at any time between December 10, 1924 and June the 10th, 1925, the day when the United Church of Canada Act came into force, any congregation of the negotiating churches, namely Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregationalist, might at a meeting regularly called decide not to enter the union. The vote of the congregation held on July 27, 1925, was conducted under the Provincial Act of Nova Scotia, which provided originally that voting in congregations within the province on church union should take place during the 6 months following June the 10th, 1925, rather than during the 6 months before that date. It also provided that a congregation that decided not to enter the union might at a later date decide to enter. The provision of the Federal Act were to prevail, except where provincial legislation had been enacted prior to the passing of the federal bill. On May 7, 1925, an amendment to the provincial legislation appeared to have removed this conflict by providing that congregational voting conducted under the provisions of the Federal Act would be taken as fulfilling the conditions of the Provincial Act. The actual wording was as follows: any vote on the question of entering the said union taken in a congregation prior to the coming into force in pursuance of and in accordance with the provisions of the Act of Incorporation shall be deemed to be the voice of such congregation for the purpose of this Act. In spite of this, the condition regarding the taking of a second vote remained and was to come under the attack of the Privy Council in its judgment. The anti-unionists had never been happy about this latter provision, claiming that if a congregation voting out was to have the opportunity to reconsider, so also those entering union should have the same privilege or opportunity. Such a provision was not included in any of the relevant legislation, to the best of my knowledge. As stated, the Church Union Act is passed by the legislature of Nova Scotia, provided that congregations that voted not to enter union might at a later congregational meeting regularly called decide to do so. This provision was not included in the federal legislation. On the basis of this provincial provision for a second vote, because the majority against union had been small, a desire soon became obvious among the unionists of St. Luke's for a second vote, hoping that the original decision would be reversed. With this in mind, the elders of the congregation, all of whom favored union, prepared a notice calling a meeting of the congregation. Dr. Johnson, the interim moderator, prevented this notice from being read from the pulpit on the basis that he, as interim moderator, had not been consulted, nor had the session met to authorize the calling of such a meeting. However, the notice was read from the choir stalls on 2 Sabbaths by Union partisans, one occasion by a minister and another by an elder, and a meeting in terms of the notice was held on July 27, 1925. The vote of this meeting was unanimously in favor of union, unanimity being due to the fact that those who opposed union did not attend the meeting because they claimed that it had not been properly or regularly called. It was on this very point that the later legal action in 4 different courts was to be based. In the trial that followed before the Chief Justice of the Province of Nova Scotia, the argument centered on the validity of this second meeting held on July 27, 1925. The Presbyterians claimed that the meeting and all its proceedings were void and of no effect because there had been no preceding meeting of session to authorize the calling of such a meeting, a step required by the Book of Forms of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The unionist plea was that the Book of Forms was not binding. It was not a code of laws, but a useful guide, and only a guide. This raised the question as to who could have called such a congregational meeting so that it would have been recognized and accepted by all parties as being regularly called and legally held. Another question is, who under federal and provincial statutes would have been recognized as competent to call and conduct such a meeting? One thing is certain. On December 22, 1924, the congregation had a regularly called and conducted a congregational meeting, voted by a small majority not to enter union. Now, according to the position of the Unionists, such a congregation after June the 10th, 1925, had no status or standing, except that of an isolated individual congregation with no connection with or relationship to any denomination or body. Since the Presbyterian Church in Canada, said the Unionists, it entered the United Church of Canada as a body on June 10, 1925, the Presbyterian Church in Canada as such no longer existed, except insofar as it was an integral unit of the new United Church of Canada. So St. Luke's was now an orphan without ministerial leadership. Reverend Mr. Walls had resigned following the first vote, and Dr. Robert Johnson, who had been interim moderator since that time, ceased to have any jurisdiction as of June 10, 1925, because the Presbytery of Pictou, which had appointed him to this office, was now a part of the United Church of Canada, but neither he nor St. Luke's congregation were. Furthermore, after June the 10th, 1925, according to the Unionist point of view, there had been no other body competent to either appoint or reappoint him to that office in the Salt Springs congregation. Whatever else might be said, this point of view indicated that neither Johnson nor St. Luke's congregation any longer came under the jurisdiction or discipline of the Presbytery of Pictou, nor of any other body. The further implication of this is that as of July 27, 1925, when the second vote was held, and during the weeks preceding, when the notices were read, Dr. Johnson had no authority in St. Luke's, neither was the congregation bound to any particular rules of procedure, such as the Book of Forms, except such rules as it should adopt for itself by agreement of its members. From this, then, it could be argued, with some justification, that the meeting and the vote of July 27th were valid. Had St. Luke's congregation associated itself with other non-concurring congregations to form a new Presbyterian body and agree to the Book of Forms as its rules of procedure, etc., then it would have been subject to them, but no such action had been taken. The leaders of the non-concurring congregations had met immediately after June 10, 1925, to reconstitute the Presbytery of Pictou of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. This the United Church would not recognize. The Presbyterian Church in Canada could not have both gone into union as a church and at the same time stayed out. That it had gone into union, they were certain. The Evening News of October 15, 1925 warned that those congregations that voted out of union were individual Presbyterian units. If they were to unite with other similar congregations to form a church, they would forfeit their right under legislation to vote into a united church at a later date, because then they would require the permission of the courts of their respective bodies. They were warned then to be aware of joining any remnant of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, which seeks to set up a new church. For the Presbyterian non-concurrents, the matter was quite different. As far as they were concerned, there was no doubt that the Presbyterian Church in Canada had continued very much alive, with a corporate existence of its own, very separate and distinct from that of those who had chosen to leave her ranks and membership in favor of an entirely new ecclesiastical structure and entity known as the United Church of Canada. From this point of view, the matter was rather simple and straightforward. St. Luke's congregation was still a part of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and therefore under the jurisdiction of the reconstituted Presbyterian Pictou, with Dr. Robert Johnson as the duly appointed and authorized interim moderator of the session. It follows from this that the congregation was still very much subject to the rules of procedure laid down in the Book of Forms, which clearly required that a duly constituted meeting of the session is the only competent authority by which a congregational meeting can be held. Should admittedly no such meeting of session is either called or convened, then the congregational meeting of July 27, 1925 could not, from this standpoint, have any validity. A group of elders only assume the authority of a session when they have been duly constituted either by the moderator of session or one properly authorized by him or by presbytery. The big question of great importance to both parties was whether the courts of the land would interpret the union legislation so as to recognize the identity of the Presbyterian Church in Canada as continuing in that body, which continued by that name, or whether they would see it as having been submerged in the United Church of Canada, with the non-concurrence beginning afresh with the establishment of an entirely new Presbyterian body in Canada. As events proceeded in this case, as in some other instances, it was those who did not enter the United Church who gained official recognition in the courts as the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Now to look at events in the various court actions in greater detail. In July of 1925, some 99 members of St. Luke's signed a petition asking the elders of the congregation to call a congregational meeting for another vote on church union. The notice read, "The undersigned members in full communion of St. Luke's Presbyterian congregation at Salt Springs hereby request the elders to call a meeting of the congregation to be held at the earliest time possible under the Constitution of the Church for the purpose of considering and voting whether or not the said congregation shall concur in the union of St. Luke's Church with the United Church of Canada and become part of the said United Church of Canada. The said meeting is to be called under Section 8 of Chapter 122 of the Statutes of Nova Scotia for the year 1924. Dated at Salt Springs, Nova Scotia, this 15th day of July, 1925. The elders acting on this position prepared the following notice of the meeting and arranged to have it read from the pulpit. Notice is hereby given that a meeting of the congregation shall be held at the church on the 27th day of July, 1925 at 2:00 p.m. for the purpose of considering and voting upon a resolution that St. Luke's Presbyterian Church, Salt Springs, concur in the union of the churches provided for in Chapter 122 of the Acts of Nova Scotia for 1924, and that the said St. Luke's Presbyterian Church of Salt Springs shall become part of the United Church of Canada. The meeting and the voting thereat shall take place under the provisions of said Section 8 of said Chapter 122 of the Acts of Nova Scotia, 1924, dated at Salt Springs, Nova Scotia, this 18th day of July, 1925. On Sunday, July 19th, the student, Mr. Harrison, acting undoubtedly on the instructions of the interim moderator, Dr. Johnson, refused to read the notice. It was read, however, during this service by one of the elders, Mr. H. McKay, from the choir. Then on July 26th, there occurred an unusual sequence of events. Dr. Robert Johnson conducted the service himself and refused to read the above notice of meeting. Furthermore, he did not give an opportunity for anyone else to read the notice until after the benediction had been pronounced. For some reason not explained, there was no collection on this Sunday, and consequently, there was not the usual break or interval in the service for giving out notices, and the benediction was pronounced before the elder got a chance to read the notice, but it was read by an elder, R.A. Robertson, from the choir stand. Being very technical, this meant that the notice had not been read during the service, but only after the service had been concluded. Therefore, it could be argued that it was not a valid notice according to the Book of Forms. However, that same afternoon, there was another service conducted by the Reverend George Farquhar, a Unionist, in which the notice in question was read. This fine point was to be mentioned later in at least one of the court actions, although it was not a major consideration. As stated earlier, the meeting, as announced, was held on July 27th and resulted in a unanimous decision in favor of union, those opposing it not being present. The following was adopted. Resolved that St. Luke's Presbyterian Church, Salt Springs, concur in the union of churches provided for by Chapter 122 of the Acts of Nova Scotia for 1924, and that St. Luke's Presbyterian Church, Salt Springs, shall become part of the United Church of Canada. Immediately after this vote on this resolution, the chairman of the meeting, W. H. McKay, an elder, declared that St. Luke's Presbyterian Church, Salt Springs, is now a part of the United Church of Canada. Following the meeting, the Unionists assumed that they had won, took over the property, and issued a letter written by Reverend George Farquhar and signed by the Kirk Assessor Alec C. McDonald, advising the student minister, Mr. Harrison, that in view of the fact that Presbyterian Pictou of the United Church of Canada had been asked to send supply to the pulpit of St. Luke's on Sunday next, he was not to conduct services there anymore. The United Church people felt that their victory by virtue of this vote entitled them to take over the church property, which they did. It was reported that they were so sure of their victory, which would prevail in any court cases that might arise, that they spent a considerable amount of money repairing and redecorating St. Luke's building while it had been in their hands. To these efforts, the Presbyterians ultimately fell heir. In the legal actions that followed pertaining to St. Luke's, the Chief Justice of Nova Scotia upheld the decision of July 27th and awarded the property to United Church people. An appeal to the full bench of the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia by the Presbyterians saw this decision reversed, with the meeting of July 27th being declared irregular, its decision null and void, and the property restored to the Presbyterians. One justice supported the Chief Justice, while three decided against him. In the court's attention at first centered primarily on the regularity and legality of the meeting of July 27th. Other related questions included the status of Dr. Robert Johnson, of St. Luke's congregation, of the elders, and of the Pictou Presbytery, of the continuing Presbyterians, now that church union had become a reality. The question of the regularity of this second meeting centered around the regulation of the Presbyterian Book of Forms that required that all congregational meetings must be called by the session either on its own initiative or at the request of members of the congregation, and whether or not this regulation was still binding upon St. Luke's. It appears that the elders, or some of them, had met prior to the calling of the meeting of July 27, 25. But because Dr. Johnson, the interim moderator, had not been present, Mr. Justice Graham declared that this meeting could not be considered as a meeting of the session and had no significance in terms of the rules of the Presbyterian Church. A legal session meeting required the President, Dr. Johnson, to preside. Furthermore, a meeting of the session was required in order to authorize a congregational meeting after union, just as before. In keeping with this and other positions of the Honorable Messrs. Roger and Graham, Mr. Justice Carroll agreed. This differed from the position which the Chief Justice had taken, namely that since July 10th, 1925, St. Luke's been an independent congregation, neither affiliated with nor responsible to any superior body, and therefore not bound by the rules of Presbyterian procedure. Thus, a properly constituted session meeting had not been required. Furthermore, even if a meeting had been held, the outcome would have been the same because the elders all supported union and the calling of a meeting for a second vote. He therefore considered that the notice given by the elders was a good notice for this purpose, because under the circumstances, the holding of a meeting of the session would have been a mere formality. The Chief Justice further contended that because it had not shown that the congregation or Church of Salt Springs ever assented to or became in any way subject to or under the jurisdiction of the Presbytery Picto formed by the non-concurrent congregations, if such was formed. St. Luke's was in no way subject to this presbytery, and therefore Dr. Johnson's appointment as interim moderator had no validity. Mr. Justice Mellish argued further that in view of St. Luke's independent status, the session had no longer any authority over it as it was then constituted. He considered that where congregations had entered the United Church, sessions continued to function as such, but not so in non-concurring congregations. Thus he wrote, I cannot come to the conclusion that the vote was bad or ineffective for any reason, and I can see no ground for holding that the congregation, by a vote fairly obtained, did not enter the United Church, even though the formalities incident to Presbyterian discipline were necessarily not complied with in obtaining such vote. Over against this, Mr. Justice Rogers stated that the question of whether the presbytery of the non-concurrence was in reality or not had no bearing on the legal situation of St. Luke's, with Justices Graham and Carroll supported Dr. Johnson's position as interim moderator as being valid. Johnson had originally been appointed on May the 5th, 1925. Rogers argued that, quote, when therefore on June 10th, 1925, the Act of Union came into effect, the position of the individual Salt Springs congregation was not affected in any way. Again, he stated, Mr. Johnson's appointment, having predated the Union, remains valid. The Honorable Mr. Graham argued that even if the Presbytery of Pictou had gone out of existence by joining the United Church, an appointment previously made by it could not expire with it. He wrote, his office depended for his existence not upon the continuity of the appointing body, but upon the continuity of the body to which he had been appointed. Mr. Justice Mellish, in discussing the relationship of St. Luke's to the rules of procedure of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, stated that since many Presbyterian congregations could call congregational meetings without reference to the sessions by virtue of provision of local acts of incorporation, I'm not at all convinced, he said, that apart from statute, the rules of the Blue Book must have been necessarily followed to attain a meeting of the congregation. But Mr. Justice Graham countered this by pointing out that the local act of incorporation of St. Luke's congregation, passed in 1906, provided that special meetings of the congregation were to be called according to the rules and forms of procedure in the church courts of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Stressing that these rules were still the constitution of St. Luke's, he went on to make this interesting point. The rule of congregational meetings being called only by the session plainly served the double purpose of prescribing the tactical course to be taken by those who propose to move in congregational matters, and of shielding and safeguarding those who oppose action. He concluded, in agreement with Justice Rogers and Carroll, that since these rules of the Presbyterian Church had not been substantially complied with, the meeting of July 27th had to be considered irregularly called and illegally held, and its decision null and void. This point of view was to prevail in later actions. There was great confusion as to the status of the elders of St. Luke's, centering around the question as to whether or not some or all of them had resigned following June the 10th, 1925. The Chief Justice states that there's no doubt that Dr. Johnson thought the elders had resigned, yet there was no clear evidence that they had, or that their resignations had been acted upon. Uncertainty and contradictions prevail. Election of new elders had been discussed, but no action taken. In the meantime, the continuing presbytery had appointed assessor elders to act with Dr. Johnson. Some of the elders had indicated their willingness to resign in the interest of the peace of the congregation, but there's no record of any formal action having been taken. Some elders told some people they had resigned, and yet told others they had not. Such confusion added to the complexity of the situation, in that it raised the question as to who belonged to the session and who did not, who could act and who could not. It also made it more essential that regular rules of procedure be followed. Justice Graham wrote, "It is not material that the moderator mistakenly assumed that the elders resigned, but it is important that some of the elders themselves told non-concurring members of the congregation that they and their fellow elders had resigned. They gave such members reason to ignore the notice, and they believed that they might safely absent themselves, as they subsequently did, from a congregational meeting irregularly called by persons who from their own statements appeared no longer to be in office. They at least made it more necessary that proceedings be clothed with prescribed formality." There was also some consideration as to whether or not the property of St. Luke's would have gone into the United Church by virtue of the July 27th meeting, if it had been declared a valid meeting. One justice felt that a further meeting would have been required to deal specifically with property. The prevailing view was, however, that had the July 27th meeting been valid, the property would have gone to United Church by virtue of the decision made that day. But since it had not been valid, the property remained Presbyterian. Mr. Justice Graham recommended that Dr. Johnson should call a session meeting at the earliest opportunity and arrange for a legitimate meeting for the taking of a legitimate vote of the congregation. If he should fail to do so, then such a meeting should be ordered by a judge of this court. Such a meeting was never held because of further court appeals. Certainly after the judgment of both the Supreme Court of Canada and the Privy Council, there would have been no point in following Mr. Justice Graham's recommendation, because the provincial legislation authorizing such a meeting and second vote was declared ultra vires by both these courts. The Supreme Court of Canada, in a decision given in February 1929, upheld the decision of the Nova Scotia Court by a 4-1 margin. Consideration here was on two main questions, namely the regularity or otherwise of the July 27th meeting and the terms of the provincial legislation under which this meeting was held in relation to the Federal Church Union Bill. The Honourable J. Duff, the only one to support the United Church point of view, stated, as of June 10th, 1925, all non-concurrent congregations had been free of all denomination affiliation and were no longer bound by the regulations of the Book of Form. Therefore, strict adherence to the Book of Form was not necessary in the case of St. Luke's and was impossible under the circumstances. He declared that what is required is a meeting fairly called in a manner conforming to the customary procedure in such a degree as is reasonably practical, and having regard to the disruption fairly demanded in the circumstances of the particular case. He felt that the elders had been entitled to act as they had, inasmuch as they alone represented the congregation. But since Dr. Johnson's position of interim moderator, in his view, ceased as of June 10th, they did not require his presence to hold a meeting. In the circumstances, it would appear that the elders did everything that could reasonably be required of them, he wrote. Mr. Justice Anglin did not concern himself greatly with these points. The other justices, namely Newcomb, Rinfret, and Smith, agreed in declaring that the rules of the Presbyterian Church in Canada continued to apply to St. Luke's after June 10th. and since these were not fulfilled, the meeting of July 27th was irregular and, quote, failed of its purpose. The statute required that a meeting for voting purposes be regularly called and held, and in the absence of specific statutory provisions to this end, the regulations of the church must prevail. They also claimed that observing the regulations was important because it was dangerous to assume, as the Chief Justice of Nova Scotia had done, that the same results would have followed if the necessary preliminaries had been observed. On the second question, we read the competence of the Provincial Act to bring a congregation into union by means of a second vote. Mr. Justice Duff stated that the way for such a vote had been cleared under the second sentence of Section 8A of the Provincial Act, which read, should such congregation decide in the manner aforesaid that a congregational meeting regularly called at any later date, at any later time to enter the union and become part of the United Church, then this act shall apply to the congregation and all the property thereof from the date of such decision. He stated that this provision in Federal Act had been intended for such cases as St. Luke's and were not made invalid because they had not been properly drafted in every detail, or infelicities of draftsmanship, as he put it. The other four justices, however, interpreted the legislation to the effect that since the Provincial Act was intended to deal with property, it was not competent to provide for a congregation to decide to enter the same United Church that had already decided under federal law not to enter. Mr. Justice Smith declared that the Provincial Act could not introduce a congregation into a Dominion corporation when that congregation had already excluded itself by its vote of non-concurrence under the Federal Act. Even if the meeting had been regular, it was ineffective to carry either the congregation or its property into the union. Mr. Justice Anglin stated that the congregation, having voted out of union under the Federal Act, had voted out once and for all, and no such second vote could bring it in. He introduced a further point in that as he interpreted the legislation, a second vote in Nova Scotia could only be held if a first meeting and vote had been held after June the 10th, 1925. Since this had not been the case, all the more reason to declare the meeting of July 27th invalid. Mr. Justice Newcomb also stated that the Provincial Act was incompetent to reverse a decision reached under federal law, especially in this case because the conditions in which Section 8A of the Nova Scotia Act were intended to operate never did in fact exist. Like his associates, he indicated that even if the meeting of July 27th had been regularly called, its purpose was to reverse the statutory election or option, which having been already competently exercised, could not be revoked by the congregation. Furthermore, the Federal Act, which alone was competent to determine membership in the United Church, had not provision for second vote for non-concurring congregations to enter union. In short, the Supreme Court of Canada held that after the union of June 10, 1925, there was no means by which the congregation could enter the United Church. The United Church then carried the case to the Privy Council in London, England. The Council paid little attention to its judgment as printed to the question on which the Council paid little attention in its judgment as printed to the question on which the various court actions in Canada had been based and decided, namely, the legality or otherwise of the congregational meeting and vote on July 27th. They considered this point had been adequately discussed and settled in the Canadian courts. Rather, the members addressed themselves to the validity of the provincial legislation under which the meeting was held and declared it to be invalid. They declared, it is obvious that the meeting was open to criticism in matters of procedure, but their lordships do not feel called upon to enter upon the question whether such criticism was necessarily fatal to the validity of the decision then taken. If such a decision, even if taken by a meeting otherwise unexceptionably regular, would have been, as their lordship hold, without competent statutory warrant, it becomes unnecessary to discuss the numerous alleged irregularities of procedure charged against it, which we discussed which are discussed at great length in the judgments of the learned judges who consider the case in Canada. In the result, their lordships find themselves in general agreement with the view of the case taken by the learned Chief Justice of Canada, which had the support of Newcomb, Rinfret, and Smith. Regarding the status of Reverend Robert Johnson and his appointment as interim moderator, both before and after June the 10th, 1925, their lordships are not prepared to pronounce upon the position occupied by Mr. Johnson, and do not find it necessary or the disposal of the case to do so. At the outset, the judgment stated that St. Luke's congregation, having voted out of union under federal law, could vote itself in only under federal law. The Federal Act did recognize the possibility of a non-concurring congregation becoming a member of the United Church at a later time, but failed to provide any means whereby such a later union could be effected. But even if detailed procedures for the late reception of non-concurring congregations that changed their minds had been provided, it was declared that the vote of July 27, 1925 could not be treated as a decision to apply to the United Church for admission. St. Luke's, having voted out of union under federal law, could not then turn around and vote itself in under provincial law. As stated, having voted out under federal law, it could only vote in under the same federal law, but the federal law made no such provision. So such change of heart on the part of St. Luke's or any other congregation presumably was impossible to implement. Property also must be subject to the original vote. The Federal Act provided guidelines as to who would enter the United Church of Canada on June the 10th, 1925. How this would be decided during the 6 months prior to that date, the protection of the rights and interests of both those who entered the Union and those who remained out. Now the congregation of St. Luke's, with which this appeal is concerned, at a meeting of the congregation held on December 22nd, 1924, as to whose regularity no question is raised, duly decided by a majority not to enter union. This declaration stood unaltered at June 10, 1925, and under the Dominion Act, St. Luke's accordingly remained outside the union and came within all the provisions of the Act applicable to non-concurring congregations. The Provincial Act concerns the property rights of both congregations within the province of Nova Scotia entering union and those not entering. It provides for congregational decisions on the question during the 6 months after June 10, 1925, rather than during the 6 months before that date, as is the case of the Federal Act. The Dominion Act provides for a congregation remaining outside the Union by a vote taken before Union, while the Provincial Act provides only for taking a congregation out of Union after it has been brought in. Section 8A of the Nova Scotia Act does not, however, profess to enable congregations on the one hand to decide not to concur within 6 months after the incorporation of the United Church, or on the other hand, at any later time to decide to enter the Union. It assumes the taking of such decision by the congregation and prescribes what shall be the effect thereof on property. Their lordships are of opinion that S8A does not competently authorize a congregation which has decided within 6 months before June 10th, 1925, not to concur in the Union, subsequently deciding to enter the Union, with the consequential effects on such property prescribed by Section 8A. The Constitution of the United Church was a matter solely for the Parliament of Canada, and it was for the Parliament to define the conditions of membership of the corporation which is set up. The provincial legislation could not competently alter the conditions of membership of the United Church, and nowhere avowedly attempt to do so. Section 8A of the Provincial Act, in providing certain consequences as regards property, which are to follow decisions of congregations, either not to concur in the Union or to enter the Union, does not and could not properly empower congregations to take such decisions, affecting, as they must necessarily do, the Constitution of the United Church. If such decisions cannot be taken consistently with the Constitution of the United Church as defined by the Parliament of Canada, then the consequences as regards property of such decisions cannot become operative. The Council recognized that reference was made in both federal and provincial statutes for congregations received in a United Church subsequent to union. No procedure, however, is prescribed in the Dominion statute for the reception of a congregation into a United Church after June 10, 1925, nor is it specified how an effective decision may be taken by a congregation with a view to its reception. As the provincial statute could not, in their lordships' view, effect the subsequent entry of a congregation into the union, the case has thus not been competently provided for in either statute. The lordships then considered whether the resolution of July 27, 1925 could be treated as a decision of St. Luke's to enter the United Church for reception, to apply to the United Church for reception. There are, in the lordships' view, insuperable difficulties in the way of so interpreting the situation. The Provincial Act states that it is to apply to any congregation deciding in favor of union at a later date, and all the property thereof from the date of such decision. But an application for reception takes time to process, and there's always the possibility of rejection. Therefore, this provision could not apply from the date of decision from this point of view. If the words of the concluding sentence of 8a, in their literal sense, imply power on the part of a congregation to enter the union at their own hand, then this enactment was beyond the competence of the provincial legislature as affecting the Constitution of the United Church, which was a matter solely for the Parliament of Canada. The Lordships noted the point also raised earlier by Mr. Justice Anglin of the Supreme Court of Canada, and agreed that a decision at a later time to enter the Union presupposed under S8A of the Nova Scotia Act a previous decision not to concur in the Union, and this previous decision would apparently have to be one taken within 6 months after the Union. The previous decision in the case of St. Luke's was taken within 6 months before the Union. Again, the validity of the meeting on July 27, 1925 is denied. The amendment to the Nova Scotia Act, passed on May 7, 1925, enables the decision of St. Luke's not to enter the Union taken on December 22, 1924, to be valid for the purpose of the Nova Scotia Act and the distribution of property, but it does not qualify as a precedent decision required as a condition for the decision at a later time, or after June 10, 1925, to enter the Union. This section required a decision not to enter a Union to be taken during the 6 months after June 10, 1925. Then another vote sometime after that on this basis. On this basis also, the meeting of July 17, 1925 was considered invalid. The Church Union Bill had been considered by many unionists to have been perfectly drawn, leaving no loopholes for possible litigation. Whatever may have been the case in regard to the bill as originally presented, as finally adopted, it proved to be somewhat less than perfect from their point of view. At the same time as this case further bears out, the federal bill, in its final form, did not adequately harmonize with the various provincial acts. After 5 years of strife and expensive court actions, the original decision of December 22, 1924 prevailed, and the property remained with the Presbyterians as it does to this day. Interestingly enough, as this is being written, active negotiations are being carried out between the Presbyterian and United Churches with the object of arranging a cooperative ministry in Salt Springs. I must qualify that because this afternoon I called the clerk of Presbyterian, Victor Presby, asked him about this, and he was very unclear about it. So I don't know where I got that information, but I have to issue that qualifying statement. Now I conclude. The writer concludes this study with these items of general interest, which also add a touch of irony. The Presbyterian court actions had been in the name of a Mr. Cameron, no relation of mine, who later was buried from St. Luke's United Church by the Reverend Douglas Gass, United Church minister of the day. Mr. Gass and I grew up in the same street in Nebraska, Nova Scotia, and later both ministered in the Charlottetown area simultaneously. Thank you very much.